On July 11th, 1274, Robert Bruce was born into one of medieval Europe's most formidable noble dynasties at Turnberry Castle in Carrick, southwestern Scotland. The fortress, perched dramatically on its rocky promontory overlooking the Firth of Clyde, served as the ancestral seat of the Earls of Carrick, a title his mother Marjorie held in her own right. This birth occurred during a period when Scotland enjoyed relative stability under Alexander III, yet the seeds of future dynastic crisis were already embedded within the complex web of noble genealogies that would define Robert's destiny. The Bruce lineage traced its Scottish origins to Robert de Bruce, a Norman knight who had accompanied William the Conqueror to England in 1066, and subsequently received substantial grants of land from David the Foss of Scotland around 1124. This original Robert de Bruce established the family's Scottish stronghold at Annandale in Dumfriesshire, creating a power base that would endure for generations. By the time of Robert's birth, the family had accumulated vast territorial holdings spanning 3 kingdoms, extensive estates in Annandale and Carrick in Scotland, the lordship of Cleveland in Yorkshire, and significant properties in County Antrim, Ireland. Robert's grandfather, Robert Bruce the Elder, known as the Competitor, had established the family's most audacious claim during the Great Cause of 1291 to 1292. When Alexander III died in 1286, followed by his heir Margaret, the Maid of Norway, in 1290, Scotland faced an unprecedented succession crisis. Multiple claimants emerged, but the 2 strongest cases belonged to John Balliol and Robert Bruce the Elder. Both men descended from David, Earl of Huntingdon, brother of Kings Malcolm IV and William the Lion. Balliol claimed through his mother de Vorgilla, daughter of Alan of Galloway and Margaret of Huntingdon, while Bruce the Elder asserted his right as son of Isabel of Huntingdon, David's second daughter. The legal intricacies of the succession dispute centred on whether proximity of blood or primogeniture should take precedence. Bruce the Elder argued that as the son of the second daughter, he stood closer in blood to the royal line than Balliol, who descended through the eldest daughter but in the 3rd generation. This argument, while legally sophisticated, ultimately failed to convince Edward VI of England, who served as overlord and arbitrator in the proceedings. On November 17th, 1292, Edward awarded the crown to John Balliol, a decision that would profoundly shape young Robert's understanding of kingship, legitimacy, and the precarious nature of royal authority. The defeat of his grandfather's claim did not diminish the Bruce family's ambitions or their conviction regarding their royal bloodline's validity. Robert grew up acutely aware that he carried within his veins what his family considered the rightful claim to Scotland's throne. This consciousness permeated his early education and shaped his understanding of his place within the feudal hierarchy. The family's continued prosperity under Balliol's reign demonstrated their pragmatic approach to politics, yet the underlying tension regarding their thwarted royal aspirations remained a constant undercurrent. Robert's education followed the established patterns of Anglo-Norman aristocratic training, reflecting the cosmopolitan nature of medieval noble society. The Bruce household, like other great noble families of the era, maintained a sophisticated cultural environment where multiple languages were spoken daily. Robert became fluent in Norman French, the language of courtly discourse and administration, Latin for ecclesiastical and scholarly purposes, and both Scots and Gaelic for communication with his diverse subjects. This multilingual capability proved essential for a nobleman whose territories encompassed different cultural regions and whose political ambitions would require him to navigate various linguistic communities. The intellectual component of his education encompassed the standard curriculum of noble youth: rhetoric, logic, arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and music. Religious instruction formed a fundamental element, not merely for spiritual development but as practical preparation for the political realities of medieval kingship, where divine sanction and ecclesiastical support were crucial for legitimacy. Robert studied the chronicles of previous Scottish kings learning the genealogies, achievements and failures that would inform his later understanding of royal precedent and tradition. Physical training began early and intensively. Medieval warfare demanded exceptional physical conditioning, and Robert's instructors ensured he developed the strength, endurance, and coordination necessary for mounted combat. He mastered the use of sword, lance, mace, and battle axe, while developing the riding skills essential for heavy cavalry tactics. The training regimen included wrestling, swimming and running, activities that built the comprehensive fitness required for campaign conditions, where knights might fight on foot when their mounts were killed or unavailable. Tournament participation provided Robert with his first taste of martial competition and public recognition. These elaborate events served multiple functions beyond entertainment. They offered young nobles opportunities to display their skills, establish reputations, and form the personal connections that would prove vital in later political and military endeavours. Robert's early tournament appearances demonstrated his natural aptitude for combat and his ability to perform under pressure before audiences that included potential allies, rivals, and marriage prospects. The tournaments of Robert's youth followed established formats that tested different aspects of knightly skill. The grand melee, resembling actual battle conditions, required participants to fight in teams using blunted weapons until one side achieved clear dominance. Individual jousts tested precision, timing and courage as armoured knights charged each other with lances at full gallop. Robert excelled particularly in the mounted encounters, displaying the combination of horsemanship, weapon handling and tactical awareness that would later serve him well in actual warfare. These competitions also provided Robert with crucial exposure to military innovations and tactical developments occurring throughout Western Europe. He observed how different regional fighting styles and equipment configurations affected combat effectiveness, knowledge that would later influence his own military reforms and strategic thinking. The international character of major tournaments meant that Robert encountered knights from France, England, Ireland and the Low Countries, broadening his understanding of contemporary military practices and political currents. The complex web of feudal obligations that governed Robert's early life reflected the intricate nature of medieval landholding and loyalty. As heir to extensive territories in multiple kingdoms, he owed homage and service to different overlords for different properties. For the Annandale estates, he held allegiance to the Scottish crown, while his English holdings in Cleveland required homage to Edward I. The Irish properties created additional complications, as they fell under English royal authority but maintained their own local customs and administrative structures. This multiplicity of allegiances was not unusual among the great noble families of the era, but it created particular tensions for the Bruces given their royal ambitions and the deteriorating relationship between Scotland and England. Robert learned to navigate these competing loyalties with considerable skill, understanding that medieval feudalism operated on personal relationships and specific obligations rather than modern concepts of national allegiance. A lord could legitimately serve different masters for different lands, provided he fulfilled his specific obligations to each. The Bruce family's landholding strategy demonstrated sophisticated estate management and political calculation. Their Scottish properties provided the foundation for their claim to royal status and their power base among the Scottish nobility. The English estates offered access to Edward I's court and the wealth generated by Yorkshire's agricultural productivity. The Irish holdings contributed additional revenue and strategic depth, while also serving as potential refugees during periods of political difficulty. Robert's father, Robert Bruce the Elder, managed these diverse holdings with considerable acumen, maintaining the family's wealth and influence despite the disappointment of the great cause. He understood that preserving the family's position required careful attention to all their feudal obligations, while avoiding actions that might provoke retaliation from any of their overlords. This pragmatic approach to feudal politics provided Robert with valuable lessons in the art of political survival and the importance of maintaining multiple options during periods of uncertainty. The education in estate management that Robert received during these years proved as important as his military training. He learned the intricacies of agricultural production, the complexities of rent collection, the challenges of maintaining armed retinues, and the diplomatic skills necessary for managing relationships with neighbouring lords. The Bruce estates employed hundreds of people directly and influenced the livelihoods of thousands more, creating a network of personal relationships and mutual obligations that would later provide crucial support for Robert's royal ambitions. As Robert matured during the 1280s and early 1290s, he witnessed the gradual deterioration of Scotland's independence under John Balliol's reign. Edward VI's increasing demands for military service and his treatment of Scotland as a subordinate kingdom created growing tensions that would ultimately explode into open warfare. Robert observed how Balliol's attempts to assert Scottish independence led to English military intervention and the king's eventual deposition in 1296, lessons that would profoundly influence his own approach to kingship and resistance. The political education Robert received during these formative years extended beyond formal instruction to include direct observation of high-level diplomatic and military decision-making. He attended court sessions, witnessed negotiations between great lords, and observed the delicate balance of power that maintained feudal society's stability. These experiences taught him to read the subtle signals that indicated shifting political allegiances and to understand the economic and military factors that ultimately determined political outcomes. The coronation of John Balliol as King of Scots at Scone Abbey on November 30th, 1292, marked the beginning of a tumultuous decade that would fundamentally reshape Scotland's political landscape and Robert Bruce's understanding of kingship. The ceremony itself followed ancient Scottish traditions, with Balliol seated upon the Stone of Destiny while receiving homage from the assembled nobles, yet the underlying circumstances betrayed the compromised nature of his authority. Edward IV's role as overlord cast a shadow over the proceedings, and the Bruce family's conspicuous absence from the homage ceremony signalled their continued rejection of Balliol's legitimacy. Robert Bruce the Elder's refusal to acknowledge Balliol's kingship stemmed from more than wounded pride over the great cause's outcome. The Bruce family maintained that their claim, based on proximity of blood rather than strict primogeniture, represented the more authentic interpretation of Scottish succession law. This position found support among several Scottish nobles who had grown uncomfortable with Edward I's increasingly heavy-handed arbitration process. The Bruces argued that Edward's decision prioritised English legal precedents over Scottish customs, effectively subordinating Scotland's crown to English interpretation of feudal law. The immediate aftermath of Balliol's coronation revealed the practical difficulties inherent in his position. As Edward's chosen candidate, Balliol faced constant suspicion from Scottish nobles who questioned whether he could effectively defend Scottish interests against English encroachment. The new king's attempts to assert independence were consistently undermined by Edward's demands for consultation on major decisions, creating a pattern of humiliation that earned Balliol the derisive nickname Tomb Tabard, or Empty Coat, among his critics. Edward's interference in Scottish affairs intensified dramatically during the early years of Balliol's reign. The English king treated Scotland as a vassal state, demanding that Scottish legal decisions be subject to English review and requiring Balliol to provide military service for English campaigns. When Scottish nobles appealed legal judgments directly to Edward's court, bypassing Balliol's authority entirely, the fiction of Scottish independence became increasingly transparent. These appeals, while technically legitimate under feudal law, systematically undermined Balliol's credibility and reduced him to little more than Edward's administrative deputy. The transformation of Scotland into an English dependency accelerated through a series of calculated humiliations designed to demonstrate Edward's supremacy. In 1293, Edward summoned Balliol to Westminster to answer charges brought by a Scottish merchant, treating the Scottish king as a mere feudal tenant rather than a sovereign ruler. The spectacle of Scotland's king standing trial in an English court shocked contemporary observers and provided Edward with a powerful demonstration of his authority over Scottish affairs. Robert Bruce witnessed these developments with growing alarm and opportunity. While his family's opposition to Balliol remained constant, the young Bruce began to understand that Edward VI's systematic degradation of Scottish kingship created possibilities for future action. The English king's heavy-handed approach was generating widespread resentment among Scottish nobles who had initially accepted Balliol's legitimacy, creating potential allies for any future Bruce claim to the throne. The crisis reached its breaking point in 1294 when Edward I demanded Scottish military service for his campaign in Gascony. This request placed Balliol in an impossible position. Compliance would confirm Scotland's subordinate status, while refusal would invite English military retaliation. The Scottish Parliament's decision to reject Edward's demand and instead negotiate a defensive alliance with France represented a desperate attempt to assert independence, but it also provided Edward with the pretext he needed for military intervention. The Franco-Scottish alliance, formalised in October 1295, marked Scotland's first significant attempt to resist English domination through foreign partnership. The treaty promised mutual military assistance and established the foundation for what would become known as the Old Alliance, a relationship that would influence Scottish foreign policy for centuries. However, the immediate practical benefits were limited, as French military assistance could not arrive quickly enough to prevent English retaliation. Robert Bruce's response to these developments reflected the complex calculations facing Scottish nobles during this period. While his family maintained their opposition to Balliol's legitimacy, they also recognised the dangers posed by Edward III's aggressive policies. The younger Robert began to understand that successful resistance to English domination would require more than genealogical arguments about royal succession. It would demand military capability, political skill, and the ability to unite Scottish nobles behind a common cause. Edward's invasion of Scotland in March 1296 demonstrated the overwhelming military superiority that England could bring to bear against Scottish resistance. The English army, estimated at over 25,000 men, represented one of the largest military forces assembled in medieval Britain. Edward's systematic approach to the campaign revealed his intention to crush Scottish independence permanently, rather than simply punish Balliol's defiance. The Siege of Berwick provided a brutal introduction to the realities of medieval warfare for those Scottish nobles who had underestimated Edward's resolve. The town's fall after minimal resistance was followed by a massacre that shocked contemporary observers with its scale and savagery. Edward's decision to allow his troops to slaughter Berwick's inhabitants served multiple purposes. It eliminated a potential centre of future resistance, demonstrated the consequences of defying English authority, and provided his army with valuable plunder to maintain morale. The massacre at Berwick established a pattern of calculated brutality that would characterise Edward's Scottish campaigns. Unlike his more restrained approach to warfare in Wales, Edward's treatment of Scottish resistance revealed his determination to eliminate any possibility of future rebellion. The psychological impact of Berwick's destruction rippled throughout Scotland, convincing many nobles that accommodation with English power offered the only realistic path to survival. John Balliol's military response to Edward's invasion proved woefully inadequate. The Scottish army that assembled to defend the realm lacked the professional leadership, tactical sophistication, and logistical support necessary to confront Edward's experienced forces. The Battle of Dunbar on April 27, 1296, demonstrated these deficiencies with devastating clarity. The Scottish cavalry's premature charge against prepared English positions resulted in a rout that effectively ended organised Scottish resistance. The aftermath of Dunbar saw the systematic dismantling of Scottish independence. Edward's forces occupied major castles throughout the kingdom, while Scottish nobles submitted individually rather than attempting coordinated resistance. The Stone of Destiny's removal from Scone Abbey to Westminster provided powerful symbolism of Scotland's subjugation, while the confiscation of Scottish royal regalia eliminated the physical symbols of independent kingship. Robert Bruce's decision to submit to Edward the following Dunbar reflected the pragmatic calculations that governed noble survival during this period. The young Bruce understood that futile resistance would result in the forfeiture of his extensive land holdings and potentially his life, while submission offered the possibility of preserving his family's position for future opportunities. His homage to Edward at Berwick in August 1296 was witnessed by numerous Scottish nobles who had reached similar conclusions about the necessity of accommodation. The terms of Robert's submission revealed Edward's sophisticated understanding of how to manage conquered territories. Rather than simply confiscating Bruce lands, Edward confirmed Robert's holdings while requiring specific obligations that bound him to English service. This approach created a system of controlled autonomy that allowed Scottish nobles to maintain their local authority while ensuring their dependence on English approval for their continued prosperity. Robert's participation in Edward's subsequent campaigns demonstrated the complex loyalties that characterised medieval feudalism. His service in the English army during the 1297 campaign against William Wallace was not unusual by contemporary standards, as feudal obligations required military service to one's overlord, regardless of personal preferences. However, this participation would later provide Robert's enemies with ammunition for accusations of treachery and opportunism. The practical experience Robert gained during these English campaigns proved invaluable for his later military career. He observed Edward I's tactical methods, logistical systems, and command structures, knowledge that would inform his own approach to warfare during his eventual rebellion. The campaigns also provided opportunities to assess the strengths and weaknesses of potential Scottish allies and enemies, intelligence that would prove crucial during his struggle for the throne. Edward II's establishment of direct English rule over Scotland represented a fundamental transformation of the kingdom's political structure. The appointment of English administrators to key positions, the imposition of English legal procedures, and the requirement that major decisions be approved by English officials effectively eliminated Scottish autonomy. This system of colonial administration created widespread resentment among Scottish nobles who found their traditional privileges curtailed and their authorities subject to English oversight. The economic impact of English rule proved particularly burdensome for Scottish society. Edward's demands for tribute, combined with the costs of maintaining English garrisons throughout Scotland, drained resources that had previously supported Scottish institutions and noble households. The redirection of Scottish revenues to English purposes created economic hardship that extended beyond the noble classes to affect merchants, craftsmen, and agricultural communities. Religious tensions added another dimension to Scottish resentment of English rule. Edward's attempts to control Scottish ecclesiastical appointments and his demands that Scottish clergy swear allegiance to English authority conflicted with traditional Scottish church independence. The Scottish clergy's resistance to these demands provided an important source of legitimacy for future rebellion, as religious opposition to English rule could be portrayed as defence of divine law against temporal tyranny. The emergence of William Wallace as a leader of Scottish resistance in 1297 demonstrated that Edward's conquest, while militarily successful, had failed to eliminate Scottish opposition entirely. Wallace's ability to mobilise support among the common people revealed the depth of anti-English sentiment and the potential for popular resistance to complement noble rebellion. Robert Bruce observed these developments with great interest, recognising that any future challenge to English rule would require broader support than traditional noble networks could provide. The Battle of Stirling Bridge on September 11, 1297, proved that English military superiority was not absolute, and that tactical skill could overcome numerical disadvantage under favourable circumstances. Wallace's victory provided crucial psychological encouragement to Scottish resistance, while demonstrating the vulnerability of English forces when separated from their logistical support and caught in unfavourable terrain. The battle's outcome encouraged Robert Bruce to reconsider the possibilities for successful rebellion against English rule. However, Edward's response to Stirling Bridge revealed the resources and determination that any Scottish rebellion would face. The English king's personal return to Scotland with a massive army demonstrated that Wallace's victory, while significant, had not fundamentally altered the balance of military power. The subsequent English victory at Falkirk in July 1298 restored English dominance while providing Edward with an opportunity to refine his tactical methods for future Scottish campaigns. Robert Bruce's evolving position during this period reflected his growing understanding of the requirements for successful rebellion. His continued nominal service to Edward I masked increasing preparations for eventual independence, as he used his position within the English system to gather intelligence, assess potential allies, and strengthen his own military capabilities. The lessons learned during this decade of English rule would prove crucial when Robert finally committed himself to the struggle for Scottish independence. The emergence of William Wallace as a leader of Scottish resistance in May 1297 fundamentally altered the political landscape that Robert Bruce had been carefully navigating since his submission to Edward I. Wallace's initial success in Lanark, where he killed Sheriff William Heselrigg in a violent confrontation that quickly escalated into open rebellion, demonstrated that popular resistance could achieve tactical victories against English administration even when the Scottish nobility remained largely quiescent. The burning of Lanark's English garrison and the seizure of its treasury provided Wallace with both symbolic legitimacy and practical resources, while his ability to attract followers from across social boundaries revealed the depth of anti-English sentiment that had been building since 1296. Robert Bruce's initial response to Wallace's uprising reflected the complex calculations that governed his political position. As a landholder who had submitted to Edward I and received confirmation of his estates, Bruce faced immediate practical concerns about the consequences of supporting rebellion. His extensive holdings in England and Ireland remained vulnerable to confiscation if he openly joined the resistance, while his Scottish properties could be seized by English administrators if his loyalty came under suspicion. The young Bruce understood that premature commitment to either side could result in the destruction of everything his family had built over generations. The strategic situation became more complex as Wallace's movement gained momentum throughout the summer of 1297. The rebel leader's ability to capture castles and defeat English forces in small engagements demonstrated tactical competence that surpassed what most observers had expected from a leader of relatively modest social origins. Wallace's siege of Dundee Castle and his successful raids against English supply lines revealed sophisticated understanding of military logistics and the vulnerabilities of occupation forces operating far from their bases. Bruce's relationship with the resistance movement during this period involved careful balancing between public compliance with English authority and private communication with rebel leaders. Evidence suggests that Bruce maintained contact with Wallace's supporters while avoiding direct participation in military actions that would compromise his official position. This approach allowed him to gather intelligence about both English military preparations and Scottish resistance capabilities while preserving his options for future action. The Battle of Stirling Bridge on September 11, 1297, transformed the political dynamics of Scottish resistance and forced Bruce to reconsider his strategic position. Wallace's tactical masterpiece, achieved through careful positioning and precise timing, demonstrated that English military superiority could be overcome through superior knowledge of local terrain and innovative tactical thinking. The destruction of the English army's vanguard as it attempted to cross the narrow bridge created a psychological impact that resonated throughout both kingdoms, proving that Edward I's forces were not invincible. The aftermath of Stirling Bridge saw Wallace's elevation to Guardian of Scotland, a position that carried both practical authority and symbolic significance. As Guardian, Wallace could issue orders in the name of John Balliol, whose theoretical kingship provided legal justification for resistance to English occupation. This constitutional framework offered Scottish nobles a mechanism for supporting resistance while maintaining the fiction that they were defending legitimate royal authority rather than engaging in treasonous rebellion. Bruce's response to Wallace's guardianship revealed his growing awareness that successful Scottish independence would require broader coalition building than his family's genealogical claims alone could provide. While the Bruces maintained their position that Balliol's kingship was illegitimate, they recognised that Wallace's popular support and military success had created new political realities that could not be ignored. The challenge facing Bruce was how to position himself to benefit from Scottish success while avoiding the consequences of English retaliation. The period of Wallace's guardianship also exposed fundamental tensions within the Scottish resistance movement regarding long-term political objectives. Wallace's commitment to restoring Balliol's kingship conflicted with Bruce family ambitions, while his reliance on popular support challenged traditional noble authority structures. These underlying conflicts would eventually undermine Scottish unity, but during 1297 and early 1298, the immediate necessity of resisting English occupation temporarily suppressed internal divisions. Edward's return to Scotland in 1298 with a massive army estimated at over 15,000 men demonstrated his determination to crush Scottish resistance permanently. The English king's personal leadership of the campaign signalled that he regarded Wallace's rebellion as a serious threat to English authority that required decisive action. The systematic nature of Edward's advance, with careful attention to logistics and coordination between different military units, revealed lessons learned from previous Scottish campaigns and his determination to avoid tactical surprises. The Battle of Falkirk on July 22, 1298, marked a turning point in both Wallace's career and Bruce's political calculations. Edward's tactical innovations, particularly his coordination of longbow archers with heavy cavalry, demonstrated military techniques that would influence European warfare for generations. The destruction of Wallace's schiltrons through sustained archery fire, followed by cavalry charges, revealed the limitations of Scottish military resources and the need for more sophisticated tactical approaches. Bruce's presence at Falkirk, fighting alongside English forces, reflected the feudal obligations that bound him to Edward's service, but contemporary accounts suggest his participation was reluctant and his performance deliberately ineffective. The complexity of medieval loyalties allowed for such nuanced positions, where technical compliance with feudal duties could coexist with private sympathy for opposing causes. Bruce's behaviour during the battle would later be interpreted by his supporters as evidence of his underlying commitment to Scottish independence. The collapse of Wallace's guardianship following Falkirk created opportunities for Bruce to assume a more prominent role in Scottish politics. The defeat had discredited popular resistance as a viable strategy against English military superiority, while simultaneously demonstrating the need for leadership that could combine noble authority with military competence. Bruce's extensive land holdings, royal bloodline and military experience positioned him as a potential alternative to Wallace's failed approach. The appointment of Robert Bruce and John Comyn as joint guardians of Scotland in 1298 represented an attempt to unite the two most powerful noble families behind Scottish resistance while managing their competing claims to the throne. This arrangement acknowledged both men's legitimate interests in Scottish independence, while theoretically subordinating personal ambitions to the broader cause of national liberation. The joint guardianship structure was designed to prevent either family from dominating Scottish politics while maximising their combined resources for resistance efforts. The practical challenges of joint guardianship became apparent immediately as Bruce and Comyn struggled to coordinate their activities effectively. Their fundamental disagreement over the ultimate objectives of Scottish resistance created constant tensions that undermined military planning and diplomatic initiatives. Comyn's commitment to restoring Balliol's kingship conflicted directly with Bruce's royal ambitions, while their personal rivalry dating back to the Great Cause added emotional intensity to political disagreements. The geographic distribution of their respective power bases further complicated coordination between the joint guardians. Bruce's strength in southwestern Scotland, centred on his Annandale and Carrick holdings, provided access to Irish Sea communications and potential foreign support, while Comyn's dominance in the northeast offered control over Scotland's richest agricultural regions and important ecclesiastical centres. These complementary advantages could have strengthened Scottish resistance if effectively coordinated, but personal rivalries prevented optimal utilisation of their combined resources. Military operations under the joint guardianship suffered from divided command structures and conflicting strategic priorities. Bruce favoured aggressive tactics designed to achieve quick victories that would enhance his personal reputation and demonstrate his fitness for kingship, while Comyn preferred defensive strategies that would preserve Scottish resources for prolonged resistance. These disagreements resulted in missed opportunities and ineffective campaigns that failed to capitalise on temporary English weaknesses. The diplomatic challenges facing the joint guardians were equally complex, as foreign powers struggled to determine which Scottish leader represented legitimate authority for treaty negotiations. The French court, while generally supportive of Scottish independence as a means of pressuring England, found it difficult to provide effective assistance when Scottish leadership remained divided. The papal curia faced similar difficulties in determining how to respond to Scottish appeals for ecclesiastical support against English occupation. Economic pressures added another dimension to the challenges facing joint guardianship. The costs of maintaining armed resistance required resources that were increasingly difficult to obtain as English occupation disrupted traditional revenue sources. The Guardians' competing priorities for resource allocation created additional tensions as each sought to preserve his own territorial base while expecting his partner to contribute disproportionately to common expenses. The personal relationship between Bruce and Comyn deteriorated steadily throughout their joint guardianship, as their fundamental incompatibility became increasingly apparent. Contemporary chronicles describe heated arguments between the two men during council meetings, with disagreements over military strategy escalating into personal attacks and accusations of treachery. The breakdown of trust between the joint guardians paralysed Scottish resistance efforts and created opportunities for English intelligence operations to exploit Scottish divisions. The resignation of both guardians in 1300 reflected their recognition that joint leadership had become counterproductive for Scottish resistance. Their replacement by Ingram de Umfraville represented an attempt to find neutral leadership that could unite Scottish nobles behind common objectives, but the underlying tensions between Bruce and Comyn supporters remained unresolved. The failure of joint guardianship demonstrated that successful Scottish independence would require resolution of the succession question rather than continued attempts to avoid it. Bruce's temporary submission to Edward in 1302 reflected his assessment that Scottish resistance lacked the unity and resources necessary for immediate success against English power. His decision to negotiate individual terms with Edward revealed sophisticated political calculation rather than simple opportunism, as he sought to preserve his position and resources for future opportunities while avoiding the fate of nobles who had been permanently dispossessed for continued resistance. The terms of Bruce's submission included confirmation of his Scottish and English holdings in exchange for renewed feudal obligations and guarantees of future loyalty. Edward's willingness to accept Bruce's return to English allegiance reflected his understanding that permanent pacification of Scotland required the cooperation of major noble families, rather than their complete destruction. The English king's policy of selective clemency was designed to encourage other Scottish nobles to abandon resistance while isolating irreconcilable opponents. Bruce's period of renewed English service from 1302 to 1306 provided him with valuable opportunities to observe English administrative methods and military preparations while rebuilding his own resources and political networks. His participation in Edward's campaigns against remaining Scottish resistance allowed him to assess the strengths and weaknesses of both sides while positioning himself for eventual return to opposition. The intelligence gathered during this period would prove crucial for his later rebellion. The execution of William Wallace in 1305 eliminated Bruce's most prominent rival for leadership of Scottish resistance, while simultaneously demonstrating Edward II's determination to crush opposition permanently. Wallace's brutal death in London, involving hanging, drawing and quartering, was designed to terrorise potential rebels while providing graphic evidence of the consequences of defying English authority. The public nature of Wallace's execution and the distribution of his body parts to Scottish towns served as a warning that resonated throughout the kingdom. The personal impact of Wallace's execution on Bruce appears to have been significant, as it eliminated any possibility of accommodation between Scottish resistance and English rule. Edward's treatment of Wallace demonstrated that even surrender would not guarantee survival for Scottish leaders, while the popular response to Wallace's martyrdom revealed the depth of anti-English sentiment that could be mobilised by effective leadership. The deteriorating relationship between Bruce and John Comyn reached its crisis point during the winter of 1305 to 1306, as both men manoeuvred for position in anticipation of a renewed resistance to English rule. Their competing claims to the throne had never been resolved, while their personal animosity had intensified during years of political rivalry and mutual suspicion. The fundamental incompatibility between their positions made violent confrontation increasingly likely as the political situation evolved. The meeting at Greyfriars Church in Dumfries on February 10, 1306, was arranged ostensibly to discuss coordination of anti-English activities, but both men arrived with armed supporters and apparent expectations of conflict. The choice of a sacred location may have been intended to prevent violence through religious sanctions, but the intensity of their rivalry had reached levels that overcame such considerations. The church's neutral ground status made it suitable for a meeting between enemies, while its location in Bruce's territorial stronghold provided him with tactical advantages. The confrontation between Bruce and Comyn escalated rapidly from verbal arguments to physical violence, as their fundamental disagreements proved impossible to resolve through negotiation. Contemporary accounts vary regarding the specific sequence of events, but all agree that Bruce struck Comyn with his dagger during a heated exchange, inflicting wounds that proved fatal despite the immediate attention of witnesses and clergy. The killing occurred before the high altar, violating sanctuary rites and creating immediate religious as well as political consequences. The murder of John Comyn transformed Bruce's political position irrevocably, eliminating any possibility of reconciliation with English authority, while simultaneously removing his primary rival for Scottish leadership. The act demonstrated Bruce's willingness to use extreme violence to achieve his political objectives, while also revealing the depth of his commitment to pursuing the throne regardless of consequences. The killing resolved the succession question through force rather than legal argument, establishing a precedent that would influence Scottish politics for generations. The immediate aftermath of Comyn's murder saw Bruce's supporters moving quickly to secure strategic positions, while his enemies organised opposition to his anticipated bid for the throne. The killing had occurred in the presence of multiple witnesses, making denial impossible and requiring Bruce to commit fully to rebellion against English authority. His supporters understood that failure would result in charges of murder and treason that would justify the most severe punishments Edward I could devise. The religious consequences of Comyn's murder proved as significant as the political ramifications, as the killing in a consecrated church violated fundamental principles of medieval Christianity. The Bishop of Glasgow's immediate excommunication of Bruce and his supporters created a spiritual crisis that threatened to undermine popular support for his cause. The papal confirmation of excommunication in March 1306 added international dimensions to Bruce's religious difficulties while providing Edward I with powerful propaganda weapons. The practical challenges facing Bruce following Comyn's murder were enormous, as he had committed himself to open rebellion without adequate military resources or guaranteed noble support. His decision to proceed with coronation despite these difficulties reflected his understanding that retreat was impossible and that success required bold action to establish legitimacy before English forces could organise effective opposition. The coronation at Scone on March 25, 1306, represented Bruce's definitive commitment to pursuing the throne regardless of consequences. The ceremony at Scone Abbey followed traditional Scottish coronation procedures as closely as circumstances permitted, with Isabel, Countess of Buchan, performing the ancient privilege of her family by placing the crown upon Bruce's head. The absence of the Stone of Destiny, removed by Edward I after his conquest, required symbolic substitutions that maintained the ceremony's legitimacy, while acknowledging the incomplete nature of Bruce's authority. The participation of Scottish bishops, despite papal excommunication, demonstrated that ecclesiastical opposition to Bruce was not universal. The immediate military situation following Bruce's coronation was precarious, as English forces throughout Scotland moved quickly to suppress his rebellion, while his own supporters remained scattered and poorly coordinated. Edward's furious response to news of Bruce's coronation and Comyn's murder demonstrated that the English king regarded these events as personal affronts that required the most severe retaliation possible. The stage was set for a struggle that would determine whether Scotland could achieve genuine independence or would face permanent subjugation under English rule. The euphoria of coronation at Scone Abbey proved devastatingly short-lived, as the harsh realities of Edward V's military response became apparent within weeks of Robert's assumption of the crown. The English king's reaction to news of both Comyn's murder and Bruce's coronation exceeded even the most pessimistic Scottish expectations in its speed and ferocity. Edward's immediate mobilisation of forces throughout northern England and his dispatch of urgent orders to English commanders in Scotland demonstrated that he viewed Bruce's rebellion not merely as another Scottish uprising to be suppressed, but as a personal challenge to his authority that demanded the complete destruction of the Bruce family and their supporters. Aymer de Valence, Earl of Pembroke, received Edward's commission to crush the rebellion with explicit instructions that reflected the English king's determination to make an example of the usurper. Pembroke's reputation as one of Edward's most capable military commanders, combined with his personal animosity toward Bruce, stemming from their previous encounters during the guardianship period, made him an ideal instrument for the systematic campaign of terror that Edward envisioned. The Earl's rapid assembly of a substantial force at Berwick, including experienced knights who'd served in Edward's Welsh and Scottish campaigns, provided him with the professional military capability necessary to confront Bruce's hastily organised forces. The strategic situation facing the newly crowned king was dire from the outset. Bruce's support base remained limited primarily to his traditional strongholds in southwestern Scotland, while the powerful Comyn network throughout the northeast had been transformed from potential allies into implacable enemies by John Comyn's murder. The killing at Greyfriars had not only eliminated Bruce's primary rival for the throne, but had also created a blood feud that would complicate his efforts to unite Scottish nobles behind his cause for years to come. Bruce's initial military preparations revealed the desperate improvisation that characterised his early reign. His forces consisted primarily of retainers from his own estates, supplemented by volunteers attracted by his royal proclamations, but lacked the professional training and equipment necessary to confront Pembroke's experienced army in conventional battle. The new king's military advisors, led by his brother Edward Bruce, and supporters like James Douglas, possessed courage and determination but little experience commanding large-scale military operations against professional English forces. The first major test of Bruce's military capabilities came at Methven near Perth on June 19, 1306. where Pembroke's tactical superiority and professional discipline proved decisive against Scottish forces that were still learning to operate as a cohesive army. The battle began favourably for Bruce's forces, who had achieved tactical surprise by attacking Pembroke's camp at dawn. But the English commander's ability to rally his troops and organise an effective counterattack demonstrated the advantages of professional military training over enthusiastic but inexperienced volunteers. The collapse of Bruce's forces at Methven occurred with shocking rapidity once Pembroke's heavy cavalry achieved momentum in their countercharge. The Scottish infantry, lacking the disciplined formations necessary to withstand mounted assault, broke and fled when confronted by armoured knights whose tactical coordination reflected years of campaigning experience. Bruce himself narrowly escaped capture only through the sacrifice of his personal guard, who fought desperately to cover his retreat while suffering catastrophic casualties in the process. The immediate aftermath of Methven saw the capture or death of numerous prominent Bruce supporters, including Christopher Seaton, who had married Bruce's sister Christian and whose execution at Dumfries provided Pembroke with his first opportunity to demonstrate Edward's policy of showing no mercy to the rebellion's leadership. Seaton's brutal death, involving hanging and beheading, established a pattern of calculated terror designed to discourage others from joining Bruce's cause while satisfying Edward's demand for exemplary punishment of traitors. The psychological impact of Methven on Bruce's remaining supporters was devastating, as the defeat had demonstrated their military inadequacy against professional English forces, while exposing the king himself to accusations of incompetent leadership. The loss of so many prominent supporters in a single engagement had decimated the rebellion's leadership structure, while providing Edward's propagandists with evidence that Bruce's cause was hopeless and that continued resistance would result only in death and destruction. Bruce's retreat westward, following Methven, brought his depleted forces into the mountainous terrain of the Scottish Highlands, where traditional military tactics became less effective, but where survival itself presented enormous challenges. The king's party, reduced to fewer than 300 men by desertion and casualties, faced the immediate problem of securing food and shelter while avoiding English patrols that were systematically searching the region for fugitives. The pursuit organised by Pembroke and his subordinates demonstrated sophisticated understanding of counterinsurgency operations, with English forces establishing a network of patrols and informants designed to prevent Bruce from establishing any secure base of operations. The systematic nature of this campaign, involving coordination between regular military units and local collaborators, created a web of surveillance that made traditional noble resistance extremely difficult to sustain. The second major defeat of Bruce's forces occurred at Dalry, near Tyndrum in August 1306, where John MacDougall of Argyll led a coalition of Highland clans loyal to the Comyn cause in a devastating ambush that nearly resulted in the king's capture or death. MacDougall's intimate knowledge of the local terrain, combined with his clan's traditional expertise in Highland warfare, created tactical conditions that negated whatever advantages Bruce's forces might have possessed in conventional combat. The ambush at Dalry revealed the extent to which Comyn's murder had transformed Highland politics, as clans that might otherwise have remained neutral or even supportive of Bruce's cause now actively hunted him as a murderer and usurper. MacDougall's ability to mobilise multiple clan contingents for coordinated action demonstrated that opposition to Bruce extended far beyond English forces, to include significant elements of Scottish society who viewed his kingship as illegitimate. The ferocity of the fighting at Dalry reflected the personal nature of the conflict between Bruce and the Comyn network, as Highland warriors sought to avenge their murdered lord through direct combat with his killer. Contemporary accounts describe hand-to-hand fighting of exceptional brutality, with quarter neither asked nor given by either side. Bruce himself reportedly fought with desperate courage, understanding that capture would mean immediate execution as both a traitor and a murderer. The king's narrow escape from Dalry achieved through the sacrifice of his rearguard and his own exceptional physical prowess, left him with fewer than 200 followers and no apparent refuge within Scotland itself. The systematic nature of the pursuit by both English forces and Scottish enemies had eliminated most potential safe havens, while the approach of winter threatened to complete the destruction that military defeats had begun. The decision to seek refuge in the Western Isles represented Bruce's recognition that conventional resistance had become impossible and that survival required adopting entirely different strategic approaches. The sea voyage from the Scottish mainland to the islands controlled by his allies among the MacDonald clan network involved enormous risks, as English naval patrols were actively searching for fugitive Scottish leaders, while winter storms made navigation extremely hazardous. The Western Isles during this period represented a unique political and cultural environment that operated according to different rules than mainland Scottish society. The island lords maintained their authority through naval power and clan loyalty, rather than feudal landholding, while their Gaelic cultural traditions emphasised personal relationships and warrior values that differed significantly from Anglo-Norman political structures. Bruce's acceptance into this environment required him to adapt to unfamiliar customs while demonstrating his worthiness through personal conduct rather than royal titles. Angus Oc MacDonald's decision to provide sanctuary for the fugitive king reflected both personal loyalty to Bruce and calculated assessment of long-term political advantages. The MacDonald lord understood that supporting Bruce involved enormous risks, as English naval power could potentially reach even the most remote islands, but he also recognised that successful restoration of Bruce's kingship would provide unprecedented opportunities for expanding MacDonald influence throughout Western Scotland. The months spent in the Western Isles provided Bruce with his first opportunity since coronation to develop comprehensive strategy rather than simply reacting to immediate crises. The relative security of island refuge, combined with access to experienced Highland warriors who understood unconventional warfare techniques, allowed the king to analyse the failures of his initial campaign while developing new approaches that might prove more effective against English military superiority. The Gaelic military traditions that Bruce encountered in the Western Isles emphasised mobility, surprise, and intimate knowledge of local terrain rather than the conventional tactics he had previously employed. Highland warriors excelled at raids, ambushes, and hit-and-run attacks that avoided direct confrontation with superior enemy forces, while gradually wearing down their opponents through constant harassment. These techniques, refined through centuries of clan warfare, offered potential solutions to the strategic problems that had led to defeats at Methven and Dalry. Bruce's education in Highland warfare extended beyond purely military techniques to include understanding of the social and economic structures that supported such operations. Highland clans maintained their military effectiveness through systems of mutual obligation and shared loyalty that differed fundamentally from feudal relationships based on landholding and formal homage. The king's appreciation of these differences would prove crucial for his later ability to mobilise Highland support for his cause. The winter of 1306 to 1307 also provided Bruce with opportunities to establish communications with potential supporters throughout Ireland, where his family's extensive landholdings had created networks of personal relationships that might be mobilised for military assistance. The MacDonald fleet's control of sea routes between Scotland and Ireland made such communications possible despite English efforts to isolate the Scottish resistance completely. Irish political conditions during this period were characterised by ongoing resistance to English authority, particularly in Ulster, where the O'Neill clan maintained effective independence despite nominal English sovereignty. Bruce's representatives found receptive audiences among Irish lords who viewed Scottish independence as complementary to their own struggles against English domination. The possibility of coordinating Scottish and Irish resistance offered strategic opportunities that had not existed during previous phases of the independence struggle. The systematic persecution of Bruce's family members and supporters by Edward I during the winter of 1306 to 1307 demonstrated the English king's determination to eliminate any possibility of future rebellion through the complete destruction of the Bruce network. The capture of Bruce's queen, Elizabeth de Burgh, along with his daughter Marjorie and his sisters Christian and Mary, provided Edward with valuable hostages while simultaneously inflicting psychological pressure on the fugitive king. The treatment of these female prisoners revealed Edward's calculated cruelty and his understanding of how to maximize the psychological impact of his revenge. Elizabeth de Burgh's imprisonment in a manor house under constant guard, while harsh, reflected her status as daughter of the Earl of Ulster and Edward's need to maintain some diplomatic relationships. However, the confinement of Bruce's sister Mary in a cage suspended from the walls of Roxburgh Castle, exposed to public view in the elements, demonstrated Edward's willingness to violate conventional standards of noble treatment when dealing with Scottish rebels. The execution of Bruce's brothers Thomas and Alexander, captured while attempting to land in Galloway with Irish reinforcements, provided Edward with additional opportunities to demonstrate the consequences of supporting the usurper king. Their deaths at Carlisle, involving the full ritual of hanging, drawing and quartering reserved for traitors, were witnessed by large crowds whose reports carried the message of English determination throughout both kingdoms. Neil Bruce's capture and execution at Berwick followed the same pattern of calculated brutality, with Edward ensuring that each death was conducted with maximum publicity to discourage others from joining his brother's cause. The systematic elimination of Bruce's male relatives was designed to destroy the dynastic foundation of his kingship, while demonstrating that royal blood provided no protection against English justice. The capture and execution of prominent Bruce supporters like Simon Fraser and John of Strathbogie extended Edward's campaign of terror beyond the royal family to encompass the broader network of nobles who had supported the rebellion. Fraser's particularly brutal death in London, where he was dragged through the streets before being hanged and dismembered, provided English audiences with entertainment, while serving as a warning to Scottish nobles who might consider supporting Bruce's cause. The imprisonment of Robert Wishart, Bishop of Glasgow, despite his clerical status, demonstrated Edward's willingness to challenge ecclesiastical immunity when dealing with Scottish resistance. Wishart's confinement in English castles, while not involving execution due to his religious position, effectively eliminated one of Bruce's most important sources of moral and political legitimacy, while warning other Scottish clergy about the consequences of supporting the rebellion. The psychological warfare conducted by Edward I through these systematic persecutions was designed to convince Bruce that continued resistance would result only in the destruction of everyone he cared about. The English king's calculated revelation of each capture and execution, often accompanied by detailed descriptions of the suffering involved, was intended to break Bruce's will to continue fighting while demonstrating to potential supporters that association with his cause meant certain death. Despite the devastating impact of these persecutions on Bruce's emotional state and political position, the king's time in exile also provided him with opportunities to develop the personal relationships and military skills that would prove essential for his eventual recovery. The intimate scale of his refugee court, reduced to a few dozen loyal followers, created bonds of personal loyalty and shared hardship that would endure throughout his later reign. The gradual development of Bruce's leadership skills during this period of crisis reflected his recognition that successful kingship required more than royal blood and noble birth. His ability to maintain morale among his followers despite repeated defeats and constant danger demonstrated personal qualities that had not been evident during his earlier political career. The king's willingness to share the hardships of exile while maintaining confidence in eventual victory provided his supporters with the psychological foundation necessary to continue resistance despite overwhelming odds. The intelligence networks that Bruce began to develop during his exile would prove crucial for his later military campaigns. as supporters throughout Scotland provided information about English troop movements and political developments while maintaining their apparent loyalty to Edward's administration. These networks, based on personal relationships and shared commitment to Scottish independence, operated more effectively than the formal diplomatic channels that had characterised earlier resistance efforts. The winter months in the Western Isles also allowed Bruce to begin developing the financial resources necessary to support renewed military operations. The island lords' control of sea routes provided opportunities for profitable raiding against English shipping, while their connections with Irish and continental merchants created possibilities for acquiring weapons and supplies that were unavailable through conventional channels. As spring 1307 approached, Bruce's position remained precarious but was no longer hopeless. The systematic persecution of his family and supporters had eliminated many potential allies, but had also demonstrated Edward's weakness by revealing his need to resort to terror rather than political accommodation. The king's education in Highland warfare had provided him with new tactical approaches that might prove more effective than his previous conventional strategies, while his growing network of supporters throughout Scotland and Ireland offered the foundation for renewed resistance efforts that could prove more sustainable than his initial campaign. The death of Edward I at Berg by Sands on July 7th, 1307, fundamentally altered the strategic landscape of the Scottish independence struggle and provided Robert Bruce with the opportunity he desperately needed to transform his precarious exile into the foundation for systematic recovery. The English king's final campaign had been characterised by the same relentless determination that had marked his previous Scottish expeditions, but his deteriorating health had prevented him from personally directing operations with his customary effectiveness. Edward's death while marching north to crush Bruce's renewed activities represented not merely the loss of England's most formidable military leader, but the removal of the one individual whose personal authority had held together the complex coalition of English administrators, Scottish collaborators, and foreign mercenaries that had maintained English dominance over Scotland. Edward II's accession to the English throne created immediate complications for the continuation of his father's Scottish policies, as the new king lacked both the military experience and the personal credibility necessary to maintain the systematic pressure that had kept Scottish resistance fragmented and ineffective. The 23-year-old Edward's reputation for frivolity and his well-known preference for court entertainments over military campaigns created widespread scepticism among English nobles about his commitment to the arduous task of completing Scotland's conquest. More significantly, his complicated relationship with Piers Gaveston and the domestic political tensions this created provided Bruce with crucial breathing space to rebuild his forces and establish secure bases of operation. The immediate English response to Edward VI's death revealed the institutional weaknesses that Bruce would exploit throughout the following years. The new king's decision to abandon the Scottish campaign and return to London for his coronation demonstrated his fundamental misunderstanding of the strategic situation, as this withdrawal provided Scottish resistance with its first opportunity to operate without constant military pressure since Bruce's coronation. The English garrisons scattered throughout Scotland suddenly found themselves isolated and vulnerable, dependent on supply lines that could be disrupted and lacking the mobile striking force that had previously prevented Scottish forces from consolidating territorial gains. Bruce's intelligence network, carefully developed during his months of exile, provided him with detailed information about English troop dispositions and the political uncertainties that were paralysing English decision-making. His agents reported widespread demoralisation among English forces in Scotland, as professional soldiers who had served under Edward I questioned whether his inexperienced son possessed the determination necessary to continue the brutal campaign of suppression that had characterised the previous reign. These reports encouraged Bruce to believe that aggressive action might achieve results that had been impossible under the formidable leadership of Edward Longshanks. The strategic approach that Bruce developed during the summer of 1307 represented a fundamental departure from the conventional tactics that had led to his earlier defeats at Methven and Dalry. His education in Highland warfare during his exile had taught him that successful resistance against superior conventional forces required avoiding direct confrontation, while systematically undermining enemy capabilities through constant harassment and the denial of secure bases. This approach, which would later be recognised as sophisticated guerrilla warfare, represented Bruce's adaptation of traditional Highland clan tactics to the broader strategic requirements of national liberation. The implementation of this new strategy began with Bruce's landing at Turnberry in February 1307, where his small force of approximately 300 men faced the immediate challenge of establishing a secure foothold in territory that had been under English control for nearly a year. The king's decision to begin operations in his own ancestral lands reflected both practical considerations about local support and symbolic recognition that his legitimacy depended on demonstrating his ability to protect his traditional followers. The initial raids against English positions in Carrick provided valuable intelligence about enemy strength, while testing the effectiveness of Highland tactics against conventional military installations. The early engagements in Carrick revealed both the potential and the limitations of Bruce's new approach to warfare. His forces proved remarkably effective at ambushing English patrols and disrupting supply convoys, but lacked the strength necessary to capture major fortifications through direct assault. This tactical situation led Bruce to develop his most innovative strategic concept: the systematic destruction of castles to deny their use to English forces, rather than attempting to hold them within inadequate garrisons that would be vulnerable to recapture. The policy of castle destruction, which would become one of Bruce's most distinctive strategic innovations, reflected sophisticated understanding of the logistical requirements for maintaining control over hostile territory. English dominance of Scotland depended fundamentally on a network of fortified positions that provided secure bases for military operations while controlling key transportation routes and population centres. By destroying these installations rather than attempting to garrison them, Bruce could deny their use to English forces while avoiding the resource commitments that would have made his own forces vulnerable to concentrated attack. The first major test of Bruce's evolving tactical approach came at Glentrool in April 1307, where his intimate knowledge of local terrain allowed him to transform a potential disaster into a significant psychological victory. Aymer de Valence's attempt to trap Bruce's forces in the narrow valley demonstrated continued English confidence in conventional military superiority, but the Scottish king's careful positioning of his men among the rocks and trees above the glen created tactical conditions that negated English advantages in heavy cavalry and professional training. The engagement at Glentrool began with Valence's forces advancing confidently into the valley, expecting to corner Bruce's outnumbered troops and complete the destruction that had begun at Methven the previous year. The English commander's tactical plan reflected conventional military wisdom about the advantages of superior numbers and professional training, but failed to account for the defensive possibilities offered by the glen's rocky terrain and dense woodland. Bruce's men, positioned on the slopes above the valley floor, possessed clear fields of fire while remaining largely invisible to the advancing English forces. The Scottish attack commenced with a devastating barrage of stones and arrows launched from concealed positions, creating chaos among the English cavalry as horses stumbled and riders found themselves unable to identify their attackers. The confined nature of the valley prevented Valence from deploying his forces effectively, while the rocky terrain made cavalry charges impossible and reduced the engagement to individual combat between dismounted knights. Under these conditions, Bruce's men fought with the desperate courage of soldiers who understood that defeat meant death, while many English troops struggled to adapt to unfamiliar tactical conditions. The psychological impact of Glentrool extended far beyond its immediate military significance, as news of Bruce's victory spread rapidly throughout Scotland and demonstrated that English forces could be defeated through superior tactics and intimate knowledge of local conditions. The engagement proved that Bruce had learned valuable lessons from his earlier defeats and was developing military capabilities that posed genuine threats to English control. More importantly, the victory provided concrete evidence that resistance to English rule remained viable, and that Bruce's kingship represented more than the desperate gesture of a fugitive pretender. The momentum generated by Glentrool enabled Bruce to achieve an even more significant victory at Loudon Hill on May 10th, 1307, where his tactical innovations proved effective against a larger English force operating in more open terrain. The battle demonstrated Bruce's growing confidence in his military abilities and his willingness to accept combat under conditions that offered genuine prospects for decisive victory rather than mere survival. The engagement at Loudon Hill began with Bruce's careful selection of a battlefield that maximised his tactical advantages while minimising English superiority in heavy cavalry. The king's engineers had prepared the ground by digging concealed trenches and placing obstacles that would disrupt cavalry charges while providing defensive positions for Scottish infantry. These preparations, conducted over several days while English forces approached, demonstrated Bruce's evolution from a reactive fugitive to a proactive military commander capable of imposing his will on enemy movements. Valance's attack at Loudon Hill followed conventional tactical patterns that had proven successful in previous engagements against Scottish forces, but Bruce's defensive preparations created conditions that transformed English strengths into vulnerabilities. The initial cavalry charge, intended to break Scottish resistance through shock and superior mobility, instead resulted in catastrophic casualties as horses and riders fell into concealed trenches or became entangled in carefully placed obstacles. The disruption of the cavalry attack allowed Scottish infantry to engage English forces under favourable conditions, where individual courage and local knowledge could overcome professional training and superior equipment. The collapse of English resistance at Loudon Hill occurred with shocking rapidity once Valance's tactical plan failed to achieve its intended results. The demoralisation of English forces, already undermined by news of Edward the Steer's death and uncertainty about continued royal support for Scottish operations, became complete when their supposedly invincible cavalry proved vulnerable to Scottish innovations. Bruce's personal leadership during the battle, fighting prominently in the front ranks while encouraging his men through both example and direct command, provided the inspirational element necessary to transform tactical advantage into complete victory. The strategic consequences of Loudon Hill extended throughout Scotland as news of the victory encouraged previously neutral nobles to reconsider their positions while demoralising English collaborators who had based their calculations on assumptions of permanent English military superiority. The battle demonstrated that Bruce possessed not only the legitimacy of royal blood, but also the military competence necessary to make his kingship effective in practical terms. The combination of genealogical claims and demonstrated battlefield success created a powerful foundation for expanded political support that had been lacking during his earlier campaigns. The period following Loudon Hill saw Bruce implementing his systematic campaign to recapture Scottish strongholds through a combination of military pressure and political negotiation that reflected his growing sophistication as both a military commander and a political leader. His approach to castle warfare during this period demonstrated remarkable tactical flexibility as he adapted his methods to the specific circumstances of each engagement rather than relying on standardised procedures that might prove inappropriate for particular situations. The recapture of his family's ancestral stronghold at Turnberry Castle in the summer of 1307 provided Bruce with both symbolic legitimacy and practical advantages that strengthened his position throughout southwestern Scotland. The castle's location on its rocky promontory offered commanding views of the Firth of Clyde, while providing secure communications with Ireland and the Western Isles. where Bruce's allies could provide reinforcements and supplies. The successful siege demonstrated Bruce's growing capability in conventional warfare, while establishing a secure base for expanded operations throughout his traditional territories. Bruce's siege techniques during this period reflected innovative approaches to the challenges of capturing fortified positions with limited resources and equipment. Rather than attempting costly direct assaults that would have resulted in prohibitive casualties, Bruce developed methods that combined blockade, psychological pressure, and targeted attacks on specific vulnerabilities to achieve surrender without devastating battles. These techniques proved particularly effective against English garrisons, whose morale had been undermined by isolation and uncertainty about royal support. The systematic nature of Bruce's castle-clearing operations became apparent as his forces moved methodically through southwestern Scotland, capturing or destroying English strongholds while carefully managing their own resources to sustain prolonged campaigning. Each successful siege provided additional weapons, supplies, and experienced personnel, while denying English forces secure bases for counterattacks. The cumulative effect of these operations was to establish Scottish control over increasingly large territories while forcing English forces to concentrate in major strongholds that became isolated and vulnerable. The evolution of Bruce's military organisation during 1307 and 1308 reflected his recognition that sustained resistance required professional capabilities that exceeded the resources of traditional feudal levies. His core force of experienced Highland warriors, supplemented by volunteers attracted by his early victories, gradually developed into a disciplined army capable of complex operations, requiring coordination between different tactical elements. The integration of conventional heavy cavalry with Highland light infantry created tactical flexibility that proved highly effective against English forces trained for more predictable combat conditions. The development of Bruce's intelligence network during this period provided him with strategic advantages that proved as important as his tactical innovations on the battlefield. His agents throughout Scotland provided detailed information about English troop movements and political developments, while maintaining communications between widely separated Scottish forces. This intelligence capability enabled Bruce to concentrate his forces for specific operations while avoiding English attempts to trap him in disadvantageous positions. The financial resources necessary to support Bruce's expanding military operations came from a combination of sources that demonstrated his growing political sophistication and territorial control. Tribute from recovered territories provided steady revenue streams, while successful raids against English positions yielded valuable plunder that could be converted into weapons and supplies. The systematic nature of Bruce's resource management enabled him to maintain the military pressure against English positions while building the administrative capabilities necessary for effective governance of recovered territories. The political dimensions of Bruce's recovery became increasingly important as his military successes attracted support from Scottish nobles who had previously remained neutral or actively collaborated with English rule. His ability to provide both military protection and political legitimacy created incentives for defection from English allegiance that proved more effective than purely military pressure. The combination of demonstrated military competence and legitimate royal authority provided a foundation for political coalition building that had been absent during his earlier campaigns. The systematic campaign to recapture Edinburgh Castle represented the culmination of Bruce's strategic evolution, from fugitive rebel to effective military commander, capable of conducting complex siege operations against major fortifications. The castle's position on its volcanic rock, combined with its strategic importance as Scotland's principal fortress, made its capture essential for establishing Bruce's credibility as a legitimate king capable of controlling Scotland's traditional centres of power. The capture of Edinburgh Castle in March 1314, through Thomas Randolph's daring night assault, marked the culmination of Bruce's systematic campaign to eliminate English strongholds throughout Scotland. but it also created the strategic conditions that would force Edward II into the massive military response that both kingdoms had been anticipating for years. The fall of Scotland's most formidable fortress, achieved through innovative tactics that saw Randolph's men scaling the supposedly impregnable north face using rope ladders in complete darkness, demonstrated that no English position remained secure against Scottish ingenuity and determination. The psychological impact of Edinburgh's capture resonated throughout both kingdoms, as the fortress had symbolised English dominance over Scotland since Edward VI's conquest nearly 2 decades earlier. The strategic significance of Edinburgh's fall extended far beyond its immediate military value, as the castle's capture effectively eliminated English administrative control over central Scotland while providing Bruce with access to the royal regalia and documentary evidence of his legitimate authority that had been stored within its vaults. The recovery of these symbols of kingship, including ancient charters and ceremonial objects that predated English occupation, strengthened Bruce's claims to legitimate sovereignty while undermining English arguments that his kingship represented mere usurpation of rightful authority. By the spring of 1314, English control over Scotland had been reduced to a handful of isolated strongholds, whose garrisons maintained precarious existence through supply lines that were constantly threatened by Scottish forces. Stirling Castle remained the most strategically important of these positions, controlling the vital crossing point of the River Forth that served as the gateway between the Scottish Highlands and the more populous lowland regions. The fortress's commanding position on its volcanic outcrop provided observation over the surrounding countryside, while its massive walls and towers had withstood numerous previous sieges throughout Scotland's turbulent history. The circumstances surrounding Stirling Castle's siege created the specific conditions that would precipitate the decisive confrontation at Bannockburn. Edward Bruce's investment of the fortress in the spring of 1313 had followed his brother's systematic strategy of eliminating English strongholds, but the prolonged nature of the siege had created opportunities for negotiation between the besiegers and the English garrison commander Sir Philip Mowbray. The agreement reached between Edward Bruce and Mowbray established that the castle would surrender to Scottish forces if not relieved by English forces before Midsummer Day 1314, a deadline that created unavoidable pressure for Edward II to mount a major campaign regardless of his preferred strategic priorities. The negotiated surrender terms reflected medieval conventions regarding siege warfare that balanced military necessity with chivalric honour, allowing garrison commanders to avoid the stigma of immediate capitulation while providing besieging forces with definite timelines for achieving their objectives. Mowbray's agreement to surrender if not relieved demonstrated his realistic assessment of his position's sustainability, while Edward Bruce's acceptance of the terms reflected confidence that English forces would be unable to mount an effective relief expedition within the specified time frame. Robert Bruce's initial reaction to his brother's agreement was reportedly furious, as the king understood that the negotiated deadline would force Edward II into precisely the type of major military confrontation that Scottish strategy had been designed to avoid. Bruce's guerrilla warfare approach had proven successful specifically because it denied English forces the opportunity to bring their superior resources and professional military advantages to bear in decisive battles. The Stirling Agreement threatened to undo years of careful strategic planning by creating conditions that favoured English conventional military superiority. However, Bruce's strategic assessment evolved as intelligence reports revealed the scale of Edward II's military preparations and the political pressures driving English decision-making. The English king's determination to mount the largest military expedition in his reign reflected not merely strategic calculations about Scottish resistance, but domestic political necessities created by noble criticism of his previous failures to complete his father's Scottish conquest. Edward's relationship with his barons had been severely strained by his favouritism toward Piers Gaveston and his apparent lack of interest in military affairs, making a successful Scottish campaign essential for restoring royal credibility. The English military preparations during the spring of 1314 demonstrated Edward II's recognition that the Scottish situation required overwhelming force to achieve decisive results. Royal writs summoned feudal levies from throughout England, while mercenary contracts brought experienced soldiers from Wales, Ireland, and continental Europe. The English army that assembled at Berwick during May and June 1314 represented the largest military force that had been deployed for Scottish operations since Edward VI's conquest campaigns, with contemporary estimates suggesting total strength exceeded 20,000 men, including approximately 2,500 heavy cavalry. The composition of Edward's army reflected both the strengths and weaknesses of English military organisation during this period. The heavy cavalry component included many of England's most experienced knights, veterans of campaigns in Scotland, Wales and Gascony, who possessed the professional skills and equipment necessary for medieval battlefield dominance. The English longbow contingents, drawn primarily from Welsh and Northern English communities with strong military traditions, provided missile capabilities that had proven decisive in previous engagements against Scottish infantry formations. However, the army's size created logistical challenges that would prove crucial during the subsequent campaign. The massive supply trains necessary to sustain such a large force required extensive planning and created vulnerabilities that Scottish forces could exploit through raids against baggage trains and supply depots. The coordination difficulties inherent in managing such a large and diverse military organisation would become apparent during the complex manoeuvring that preceded the battle itself. Bruce's response to intelligence about English military preparations demonstrated his evolution into a sophisticated strategic thinker, capable of adapting his methods to changing circumstances. Rather than attempting to avoid the confrontation that his brother's agreement had made inevitable, Bruce began planning for a defensive battle that would maximise Scottish advantages while minimising English strengths. His selection of the Bannockburn area as the probable battlefield reflected careful analysis of terrain features that could neutralise English cavalry superiority while providing defensive positions suitable for Scottish infantry tactics. The terrain around Bannockburn offered several advantages for defensive operations that Bruce's military engineers exploited through careful preparation during the weeks preceding Edward's arrival. The area's numerous streams and marshy ground would impede cavalry operations while providing natural obstacles that could channel English attacks into predetermined killing zones. The elevated positions south of the Bannockburn itself offered commanding fields of fire, while the dense woodland in several areas provided concealment for Scottish forces and obstacles to English formations. Bruce's army during the summer of 1314 represented the culmination of his military reforms and the integration of diverse tactical elements into a coherent fighting force capable of confronting English conventional superiority under favourable conditions. The core of Scottish strength lay in the Schiltron formations, dense masses of spearmen whose 12-foot weapons could present impenetrable barriers to cavalry charges when properly positioned and disciplined. These formations had evolved considerably from the static defensive circles employed by William Wallace at Falkirk, developing mobility and tactical flexibility that allowed them to manoeuvre on the battlefield while maintaining their defensive integrity. The Scottish Schiltrons of 1314 incorporated lessons learned from years of guerrilla warfare and siege operations that had tested individual soldiers under diverse combat conditions. The men who formed these formations possessed combat experience that exceeded that of many English soldiers, having participated in the systematic campaign to recapture Scottish strongholds while developing confidence in their weapons and tactics through repeated success. The integration of Highland warriors with Lowland spearmen created tactical diversity within the formations while maintaining the disciplined cohesion necessary for effective spear tactics. Bruce's tactical innovations extended beyond the Schiltron formations themselves to include supporting elements that enhanced their battlefield effectiveness. Like cavalry units, drawn primarily from border families with extensive experience in mounted warfare, provided reconnaissance capabilities and tactical flexibility that complemented the infantry formation's defensive strength. Archers, while fewer in number than their English counterparts, were positioned to provide supporting fire during critical phases of the engagement, while remaining protected by the spear formations. The Scottish Army's organisation reflected Bruce's understanding that successful battle required coordination between different tactical elements rather than reliance on any single formation or weapon system. Command structures had been developed through years of campaign experience, with subordinate leaders like Thomas Randolph, Edward Bruce, and James Douglas possessing both personal authority and tactical competence necessary for independent decision-making during the confusion of battle. Edward II's advance from Berwick towards Stirling during mid-June 1314 followed a route that demonstrated both the logistical capabilities and strategic limitations of his massive army. The English force's progress was necessarily slow due to its size and the extensive supply train required to sustain such numbers, providing Bruce with detailed intelligence about enemy movements and intentions. Scottish scouts reported the army's composition, order of march, and apparent tactical dispositions, while English foraging parties encountered increasing resistance as they approached Scottish-controlled territory. The English king's decision to approach Stirling via the direct route through Falkirk rather than attempting to outflank Scottish positions reflected confidence in his army's ability to overwhelm any resistance through superior numbers and professional capability. This strategic approach demonstrated Edward's fundamental misunderstanding of the tactical situation he would encounter, as his conventional military thinking failed to account for the defensive advantages that Bruce had prepared, or the evolution of Scottish military capabilities since previous English victories. The preliminary skirmishing that occurred as English forces approached the Bannockburn area provided both armies with opportunities to assess their opponent's capabilities while testing tactical approaches that would influence the main engagement. Scottish raids against English supply lines demonstrated continued effectiveness of guerrilla tactics while revealing information about enemy dispositions and morale. English reconnaissance efforts encountered determined resistance that prevented detailed intelligence gathering, while exposing their forces to harassment that gradually eroded confidence and effectiveness. The famous encounter between Robert Bruce and Henry de Bohun on June 23, 1314, epitomised the personal nature of medieval warfare, while providing both armies with powerful psychological symbols that would influence the subsequent battle. De Bohun's attempt to achieve individual glory by challenging the Scottish king to single combat reflected chivalric traditions that emphasised personal prowess and honour, but his death at Bruce's hands demonstrated that the Scottish leader possessed not only royal authority, but also the physical capabilities necessary to lead his forces in combat. The immediate tactical significance of Bruce's victory over de Bohun extended beyond its symbolic value to include practical effects on both armies' morale and confidence. Scottish forces witnessed their king's personal courage and martial skill, while English troops observed the defeat of one of their most prominent knights by an opponent they had been taught to regard as a usurper and rebel. The incident established psychological conditions that would influence individual combat decisions throughout the subsequent engagement. The deployment of both armies during the evening of June 23rd and the morning of June 24th reflected the commanders' contrasting strategic approaches and their assessments of battlefield conditions. Bruce positioned his forces to maximise defensive advantages while maintaining tactical flexibility, with schiltron formations occupying elevated ground that provided observation and fields of fire while remaining capable of offensive movement if opportunities developed. The Scottish deployment demonstrated sophisticated understanding of combined arms tactics, with different unit types positioned to provide mutual support while maintaining their individual tactical integrity. Edward's deployment reflected conventional military wisdom about the employment of superior numbers and professional capabilities, but failed to account adequately for the specific terrain conditions and tactical innovations that characterised the Scottish position. The English formation emphasised the traditional dominance of heavy cavalry supported by archer fire, with infantry formations providing reserve strength and tactical depth. However, the army's size created coordination difficulties while the unfamiliar terrain limited the effectiveness of standard tactical approaches. The battle itself commenced with English attempts to outflank Scottish positions through coordinated attacks that would have proven effective against conventional defensive formations. The initial English assault demonstrated professional competence and tactical coordination that reflected years of military experience, but encountered Scottish defensive preparations that had been specifically designed to counter such approaches. The marshy ground and concealed obstacles that Bruce's engineers had prepared channeled English attacks into predetermined zones where Scottish weapons and tactics proved most effective. The collapse of the initial English attacks created tactical conditions that allowed Scottish forces to transition from defensive to offensive operations while maintaining their formation integrity and command coordination. The Schiltron's mobility, developed through years of guerrilla warfare experience, enabled them to advance against disrupted English formations while presenting coordinated spear points that cavalry could not penetrate. The psychological impact of this tactical transition proved as important as its immediate military effects, as English forces found themselves confronting opponents who possessed both defensive strength and offensive capability. The systematic destruction of English cavalry formations during the morning of June 24th demonstrated the effectiveness of Bruce's tactical innovations and the combat experience of his troops. The heavy losses among English knights, including many of the kingdom's most experienced military leaders, eliminated the professional core of Edward's army, while creating panic among supporting formations. The death or capture of prominent English nobles provided immediate tactical advantages while establishing the foundation for Scottish political gains that would extend far beyond the battlefield itself. The rout of Edward II's army during the afternoon of June 24th occurred with shocking completeness, as the systematic collapse of English resistance created conditions where individual survival became more important than unit cohesion or tactical objectives. The English king's flight from the battlefield, while militarily prudent given the tactical situation, provided powerful symbolic evidence of Scottish victory while eliminating any possibility of English recovery during the immediate aftermath of the battle. The immediate aftermath of Bannockburn witnessed a transformation in Robert Bruce's strategic position that extended far beyond the battlefield itself, as the comprehensive nature of the English defeat created opportunities for territorial consolidation and political legitimization that had been unimaginable during his years as a fugitive king. The systematic destruction of Edward II's massive army had eliminated the primary instrument of English authority in Scotland, while simultaneously demonstrating to European observers that Scottish independence represented a permanent political reality rather than a temporary rebellion. The capture of numerous prominent English nobles, including the Earl of Hereford, and scores of knights whose ransoms would finance Scottish military operations for years to come, provided Bruce with both immediate financial resources and valuable hostages whose exchange could secure the release of Scottish prisoners held in English captivity since the early years of his reign. The strategic implications of the victory became apparent within weeks, as English garrisons throughout Scotland found themselves isolated and vulnerable to Scottish assault without any prospect of relief from the south. Stirling Castle's immediate surrender following Mowbray's return from the battlefield fulfilled the terms negotiated the previous year, but the fortress's capitulation represented merely the beginning of a systematic campaign to eliminate the remaining centres of English resistance. Bruce's forces moved methodically against the scattered strongholds that had maintained English authority over key transportation routes and population centres, employing the siege techniques and tactical innovations that had proven effective during the previous years of guerrilla warfare. The capture of Bothwell Castle in August 1314 demonstrated the evolution of Scottish military capabilities from the desperate improvisation of Bruce's early campaigns to the professional competence of an army capable of conducting complex siege operations against major fortifications. The castle's massive walls and strategic position controlling the Clyde Valley had made it one of Scotland's most formidable strongholds, yet the garrison's surrender after minimal resistance reflected the demoralisation that had spread throughout English forces following Bannockburn. The systematic nature of the siege, involving coordinated assaults supported by siege engines and undermining operations, revealed Scottish mastery of conventional military techniques that complemented their established expertise in irregular warfare. The methodical reduction of English strongholds throughout late 1314 and early 1315 followed patterns that Bruce had developed during his earlier campaigns, with each successful siege providing additional resources while denying English forces secure bases for future operations. Roxburgh Castle's capture in February 1315 through James Douglas's night assault eliminated English control over the crucial border region, while the fortress's destruction, according to Bruce's established policy, prevented its future use by enemy forces. The systematic demolition of captured castles, while militarily sound, also served important political purposes by demonstrating Scottish determination to prevent any future English occupation regardless of the defensive value these positions might provide against other enemies. The administrative challenges created by territorial expansion required Bruce to develop governmental institutions capable of managing recovered regions while maintaining the military pressure necessary to complete Scottish liberation. The restoration of Scottish administrative structures in formerly English-controlled territories involved complex negotiations with local populations whose loyalties had been shaped by years of occupation and whose economic relationships had been disrupted by constant warfare. Bruce's approach to these challenges demonstrated sophisticated understanding of the political requirements for sustainable governance, as he balanced the need for immediate military resources against the long-term necessity of establishing legitimate authority over diverse populations. The re-establishment of the Scottish Exchequer represented one of Bruce's most significant administrative achievements during this period, as the systematic collection and management of royal revenues provided the financial foundation necessary to support expanded military operations while funding the governmental apparatus required for effective territorial control. The Exchequer's operations, based in Perth to reflect the shifting centre of Scottish political gravity away from English-influenced southern regions, employed administrative procedures that combined traditional Scottish practices with innovations developed during the independence struggle. The careful documentation of revenues and expenditures that characterised the restored Exchequer's operations provided Bruce with detailed information about his kingdom's economic resources while establishing precedents for financial accountability that would influence Scottish governmental development for generations. The complexity of revenue collection in a kingdom that had experienced nearly 2 decades of warfare and occupation required innovative approaches to traditional feudal obligations and royal prerogatives. Many Scottish nobles had lost substantial portions of their estates through confiscation or destruction, while others had accumulated new holdings through service to Bruce's cause or the forfeiture of enemy properties. The redistribution of lands confiscated from English collaborators provided Bruce with opportunities to reward loyal supporters, while ensuring that recovered territories remained under reliable control. But these transfers also created legal complications regarding traditional feudal relationships and hereditary claims that required careful adjudication. The judicial system's restoration proved equally complex, as Bruce's government needed to establish legal procedures capable of addressing the accumulated grievances and property disputes that had resulted from years of warfare while maintaining the royal authority necessary for effective governance. The appointment of justiciars and sheriffs to administer royal justice in recovered territories involved careful selection of individuals who possessed both legal competence and political reliability, as these officials would serve as the primary representatives of royal authority in regions where English influence remained strong among certain population segments. The integration of traditional Scottish legal procedures with innovations developed during the independence struggle created a judicial system that reflected both continuity with pre-war institutions and adaptation to the changed circumstances of Bruce's kingdom. The diplomatic challenges facing Bruce's government during this period of consolidation required sophisticated understanding of European political dynamics and the complex relationships between secular and ecclesiastical authority that governed international recognition of royal legitimacy. The papal excommunication that had been imposed following John Comyn's murder continued to complicate Scottish efforts to achieve full international recognition, while Edward II's diplomatic protests against Scottish independence found receptive audiences among European rulers who feared the precedent that successful rebellion might establish for their own kingdoms. Bruce's diplomatic strategy during these years involved careful cultivation of relationships with powers whose interests conflicted with English expansion, while demonstrating Scottish willingness to participate in the broader European political and religious community as a legitimate sovereign state. The French alliance, formalised through a series of treaties negotiated during 1315 and 1316, provided Bruce with his most important diplomatic achievement during the consolidation period, as French recognition of Scottish independence created a powerful precedent that other European powers could follow while establishing military cooperation that threatened English interests on multiple fronts. The alliance's terms reflected mutual recognition of shared interests in containing English expansion, with French commitments to provide military assistance balanced against Scottish obligations to support French operations in Gascony and other contested territories. The practical implementation of these agreements involved complex negotiations regarding military coordination and resource sharing that tested both kingdoms' diplomatic capabilities while establishing patterns of cooperation that would influence European politics for centuries. The papal diplomacy that Bruce pursued during these years represented perhaps his most challenging international objective, as achieving ecclesiastical recognition of his kingship required overcoming not only the excommunication imposed for Comyn's murder, but also the broader papal policy of supporting established monarchical authority against rebellious subjects. The Scottish appeals to Rome emphasised themes of national liberation and religious freedom that resonated with papal concerns about secular interference in ecclesiastical affairs, while carefully avoiding direct challenges to papal authority that might provoke irreversible opposition. The gradual modification of papal positions regarding Scottish independence reflected both Bruce's diplomatic skill and the changing European political situation that made papal support for English claims increasingly problematic. The economic dimensions of consolidation required Bruce to address the systematic disruption of Scottish commercial relationships that had resulted from nearly 2 decades of warfare and English occupation. The restoration of trade connections with continental markets involved complex negotiations with merchant communities whose previous relationships had been disrupted by political conflicts, while the re-establishment of internal commercial networks required careful attention to the security of transportation routes and the standardization of weights, measures, and currency that facilitated economic exchange. Bruce's policies during this period demonstrated understanding of the relationship between economic prosperity and political stability, as his government actively promoted commercial recovery while ensuring that expanded trade relationships contributed to royal revenues through customs, duties, and market fees. The agricultural recovery that accompanied territorial consolidation reflected both the resilience of Scottish rural communities and the effectiveness of Bruce's policies regarding land tenure and peasant obligations. The systematic destruction that had characterised English punitive expeditions during the occupation period had severely disrupted agricultural production in many regions, while the constant movement of armies had prevented normal seasonal cultivation and harvest cycles. Bruce's approach to agricultural restoration involved careful balance between the immediate need for food production to support military operations and the long-term requirement for sustainable rural economies that could provide stable foundations for royal authority. The redistribution of forfeited estates provided Bruce with unprecedented opportunities to reshape Scottish noble society, while rewarding the supporters whose loyalty had enabled his ultimate victory. The confiscation of properties belonging to Scottish nobles who had maintained English allegiance created a substantial pool of lands that could be granted to individuals whose service had proven crucial for Scottish success. But these redistributions also required careful attention to traditional feudal relationships and regional power balances that might be disrupted by dramatic changes in landholding patterns. Bruce's approach to these grants demonstrated sophisticated political calculation as he sought to strengthen his supporters while avoiding the creation of new noble coalitions that might challenge royal authority. The integration of Highland clans into Bruce's expanded kingdom required particularly careful diplomatic and administrative management, as these communities had maintained semi-autonomous status throughout previous periods of Scottish history, while possessing military capabilities that could prove either invaluable assets or dangerous threats depending on their political allegiances. The clan leaders who had supported Bruce during his exile and early campaigns expected substantial rewards for their loyalty, but their traditional governance structures and cultural practices differed significantly from the feudal relationships that characterised lowland Scottish society. Bruce's success in maintaining Highland support while integrating clan territories into his administrative system reflected his understanding of the diverse political traditions that comprised medieval Scotland. The military reforms that Bruce implemented during the consolidation period transformed the temporary expedients of guerrilla warfare into permanent institutional changes that would influence Scottish military organisation for generations. The professional corps of veterans who had fought through the independence struggle provided the foundation for a standing military force capable of defending Scottish independence against future English attacks while maintaining internal security throughout the expanded kingdom. The integration of Highland tactics with conventional military procedures created tactical flexibility that proved particularly effective in the border warfare that continued throughout this period, as Scottish forces demonstrated ability to adapt their methods to diverse operational requirements. The fortification policies that Bruce pursued during these years reflected lessons learned from his systematic campaign against English strongholds, as his government sought to establish defensive positions that could protect Scottish territories without creating the vulnerabilities that had characterised previous fortification systems. The selective reconstruction of certain castles, combined with the continued demolition of others, demonstrated strategic thinking that prioritised mobile defence over static fortifications, while ensuring that key positions remained under reliable Scottish control. The resources devoted to these projects reflected Bruce's understanding that military preparedness required constant attention, even during periods of apparent peace, as English hostility towards Scottish independence guaranteed future conflicts regardless of immediate diplomatic developments. The ecclesiastical policies that Bruce developed during the consolidation period addressed both the practical requirements of governing a Christian kingdom and the specific challenges created by his excommunication and the complex relationships between Scottish religious institutions and international ecclesiastical authority. The appointment of bishops and abbots who supported Scottish independence while maintaining theological orthodoxy required careful navigation of competing claims and jurisdictional disputes that had been complicated by years of political conflict. Bruce's success in maintaining Scottish ecclesiastical autonomy while gradually improving relationships with papal authority demonstrated diplomatic skill that complemented his military and administrative achievements. The cultural dimensions of consolidation involved Bruce's efforts to establish distinctly Scottish identity and traditions that would strengthen popular support for independence, while differentiating his kingdom from English cultural influences that had penetrated Scottish society during the occupation period. The promotion of Gaelic traditions alongside Anglo-Norman customs reflected the diverse cultural heritage of Bruce's kingdom, while the encouragement of Scottish literary and artistic production provided cultural foundations for political independence that extended beyond military and administrative achievements. These cultural policies demonstrated Bruce's understanding that sustainable independence required popular identification with Scottish institutions and traditions, rather than merely opposition to English rule. The intelligence networks that Bruce had developed during his guerrilla campaigns evolved into sophisticated information-gathering systems that provided his government with detailed knowledge of English military preparations and political developments, while maintaining communications with Scottish supporters in English-controlled territories. The systematic nature of these intelligence operations reflected professional capabilities that exceeded the informal networks characteristic of earlier periods, while the integration of intelligence gathering with diplomatic and commercial activities created multiple sources of information that enhanced Scottish strategic planning capabilities. The financial innovations that accompanied territorial expansion included the development of new revenue sources that reflected the changed economic and political circumstances of Bruce's enlarged kingdom. The systematic exploitation of mineral resources, particularly in regions that had been underdeveloped during the English occupation, provided substantial additions to royal revenues while demonstrating Scottish control over territories that England continued to claim. The expansion of customs collection and the establishment of new markets reflected economic growth that accompanied political stability, while the careful management of extraordinary taxation for military purposes demonstrated fiscal responsibility that enhanced popular support for Bruce's government. The consolidation of Scottish independence achieved through military conquest and administrative reconstruction during the years following Bannockburn created the foundation for Bruce's most ambitious diplomatic initiative, securing formal recognition of Scottish sovereignty from the papal court at Avignon. The systematic elimination of English strongholds and the restoration of Scottish governmental institutions had established practical independence, but the continued papal excommunication of Bruce and his supporters, combined with Edward II's persistent diplomatic protests against Scottish legitimacy, threatened to isolate Scotland from the broader European Christian community. The challenge facing Bruce's government was to overcome ecclesiastical opposition rooted in the circumstances of his accession, while demonstrating that Scottish independence served broader Christian interests, rather than merely personal ambition. The political situation within Scotland during 1320 provided both opportunities and complications for Bruce's diplomatic objectives, as the stability achieved through territorial consolidation had allowed previously suppressed tensions within Scottish noble society to resurface in ways that threatened the unity essential for effective international negotiations. The Souls Conspiracy, discovered in August 1320, revealed that significant elements within the Scottish nobility remained dissatisfied with Bruce's kingship and were actively plotting his assassination in coordination with English agents. The conspiracy's leadership included prominent nobles like William Souls, the hereditary butler of Scotland, and David Brechin, whose family connections and territorial holdings had given them access to the highest levels of Bruce's government, while they secretly negotiated with Edward II's representatives. The discovery of the conspiracy through Bruce's intelligence networks demonstrated both the effectiveness of the information-gathering systems developed during the independence struggle and the persistent vulnerabilities that threatened Scottish political stability. The plotters' plan to murder Bruce during a Parliament session at Scone revealed sophisticated coordination with English diplomatic initiatives, as Edward II had apparently promised substantial territorial grants and political positions to Scottish nobles who would eliminate his rival and restore English authority. The conspiracy's scope, involving coordination between Scottish malcontents and English officials across multiple regions, indicated that English efforts to undermine Scottish independence had evolved from direct military confrontation to more subtle forms of political warfare. Bruce's response to the Souls conspiracy demonstrated the harsh realities of medieval kingship, while revealing his determination to eliminate internal threats that could compromise Scottish independence. The trials conducted at Scone in August 1320 followed legal procedures that provided the accused with opportunities to defend themselves, but the evidence of treasonous correspondence with English agents left little doubt regarding their guilt. The executions of William Souls and several co-conspirators served both judicial and political purposes, eliminating immediate threats while demonstrating to potential collaborators that treason against Scottish independence would face severe consequences regardless of the perpetrator's social status or family connections. The political aftermath of the conspiracy's suppression created opportunities for Bruce to strengthen his government through the redistribution of forfeited estates, while demonstrating to European observers that Scottish independence enjoyed genuine popular support rather than depending solely on military coercion. The confiscation of the conspirators' lands provided resources for rewarding loyal supporters while eliminating potential centres of future resistance. But the careful legal procedures followed during the trials demonstrated that Bruce's government operated according to established principles of justice, rather than arbitrary royal will. The documentation of the conspiracy's details, including the correspondence with English agents, provided valuable propaganda material that could be used to justify Scottish independence as defence against English subversion rather than aggressive rebellion. The composition of the Declaration of Arbroath during the spring of 1320 represented the culmination of years of diplomatic preparation and legal scholarship, as Bruce's advisers crafted a document that addressed papal concerns about legitimate authority while articulating principles of popular sovereignty that would influence political thought for centuries. The Declaration's authorship involved collaboration between Scotland's most learned clerks and legal scholars, including Bernard de Linton, the Abbot of Arbroath and Chancellor of Scotland, whose ecclesiastical position and scholarly reputation provided credibility for the document's theological and legal arguments. The careful construction of the Declaration's Latin prose reflected sophisticated understanding of papal diplomatic procedures and the legal precedents that governed ecclesiastical recognition of royal authority. The theological arguments presented in the Declaration of Arbroath demonstrated sophisticated engagement with contemporary debates about the relationship between divine sanction and popular consent in legitimate governance. The document's famous assertion that the Scottish people would choose another king if Bruce failed to defend their liberties represented a radical departure from conventional medieval theories of royal authority, which typically emphasised divine appointment and hereditary succession rather than popular approval. This articulation of conditional kingship reflected both practical political necessities created by Bruce's disputed succession and broader intellectual developments within medieval political thought that were beginning to question absolute monarchical authority. The historical narrative presented in the Declaration traced Scottish independence to ancient origins that predated English claims to overlordship, employing scholarly research into Scottish chronicles and genealogical records to establish continuity between contemporary resistance and traditional Scottish sovereignty. The document's description of Scottish history emphasised themes of persistent independence and successful resistance to foreign domination that resonated with papal concerns about protecting Christian communities from unjust oppression. The careful documentation of English atrocities during the occupation period, including detailed accounts of massacres and the systematic destruction of religious institutions, provided concrete evidence that Scottish resistance served legitimate defensive purposes rather than aggressive ambition. The diplomatic strategy underlying the declaration involved careful coordination with Scottish representatives at the papal court, who had been cultivating relationships with influential cardinals and papal officials throughout the preceding years. The timing of the declaration's dispatch to Avignon reflected intelligence about papal political priorities and the international situation that might influence ecclesiastical decision-making regarding Scottish appeals. The document's arrival at the papal court coincided with broader European diplomatic developments that were creating tensions between papal authority and secular rulers, providing opportunities for Scottish arguments to receive sympathetic consideration from ecclesiastical officials who were increasingly concerned about secular interference in church affairs. The military campaigns that Bruce conducted during 1320 and 1321 were designed to maintain pressure on English positions while demonstrating Scottish military capability to European observers who might question whether Scottish independence could be sustained against English retaliation. The systematic raids into northern England during this period followed established patterns of border warfare, but were conducted with particular attention to their diplomatic implications, as Bruce sought to demonstrate Scottish strength while avoiding provocations that might undermine papal sympathy for Scottish appeals. The careful targeting of military operations against English administrative centres and supply bases rather than civilian populations reflected sophisticated understanding of how military actions would be interpreted by ecclesiastical observers concerned about just war principles. The Siege of Carlisle in 1315 had established important precedents for Scottish military operations in English territory, as Bruce's forces had demonstrated capability to threaten major English strongholds while maintaining disciplined conduct that contrasted favourably with English behaviour during their Scottish campaigns. The siege's duration, lasting several months despite the city's formidable fortifications, proved that Scottish forces possessed the logistical capabilities and siege expertise necessary to conduct sustained operations in enemy territory. The ultimate withdrawal from Carlisle reflected strategic calculation rather than a military failure, as Bruce recognised that capturing the city would require resources that could be more effectively employed in consolidating Scottish territorial gains. The Irish dimension of Bruce's strategy during this period involved his brother Edward's campaigns to establish a second front that would divide English military resources while creating opportunities for coordinated operations that could overwhelm English defensive capabilities. Edward Bruce's coronation as High King of Ireland in 1316 represented an ambitious attempt to extend Scottish independence principles to another Celtic kingdom suffering under English domination. But the practical challenges of maintaining Scottish forces in Ireland while defending Scotland itself proved enormous. The complex political situation in Ireland, where traditional clan rivalries intersected with English colonial administration, created opportunities for Scottish intervention, but also generated complications that ultimately proved insurmountable. The death of Edward Bruce at the Battle of Falkirk in October 1318 eliminated the Irish front while providing Edward II with his first significant military victory against Bruce forces since the early years of Robert's reign. The loss of his brother and designated heir created both personal grief and political complications for Bruce, as the succession question that had been temporarily resolved through Edward's position as heir presumptive now required new arrangements that could ensure dynastic continuity. The Irish campaign's failure demonstrated the limitations of Scottish military resources and the difficulties of sustaining operations across multiple fronts, but the 3-year duration of Scottish presence in Ireland had proven that English authority remained vulnerable to coordinated Celtic resistance. The diplomatic negotiations that followed Edward Bruce's death involved complex discussions with Irish clan leaders who had supported Scottish intervention while seeking to maintain their positions under renewed English authority. The withdrawal of Scottish forces from Ireland required careful coordination to prevent reprisals against Irish supporters, while preserving relationships that might prove valuable for future operations. The lessons learned from the Irish campaign influenced Bruce's subsequent strategic thinking, particularly regarding the importance of secure supply lines and reliable local support for operations in enemy territory. The papal response to the Declaration of Arbroath revealed the complex considerations that influenced ecclesiastical policy regarding secular political disputes, as the papal court sought to balance competing claims while maintaining church authority over questions of legitimate governance. The initial papal reactions to the Scottish appeals were cautiously favourable, particularly regarding the documented evidence of English atrocities and the theological arguments about defensive warfare, but papal officials remained concerned about recognising rebellion against established authority even when that rebellion appeared justified by circumstances. The gradual evolution of papal positions regarding Scottish independence reflected both the persuasive power of Scottish diplomatic arguments and changing European political conditions that made papal support for English claims increasingly problematic. The economic warfare that accompanied military operations during this period involved systematic efforts to disrupt English commercial relationships while strengthening Scottish trade connections with continental markets that could provide both revenues and political support. The Scottish raids against English merchant convoys and coastal trading centres demonstrated naval capabilities that complemented land-based military operations, while generating resources that could finance continued resistance efforts. The development of Scottish trading relationships with Flemish merchants and French commercial centres created economic foundations for independence that reduced Scottish dependence on English markets, while providing alternative sources for manufactured goods and luxury items. The fortification projects that Bruce initiated during this period reflected lessons learned from his systematic campaign against English strongholds, as Scottish engineers developed defensive concepts that emphasised mobility and mutual support rather than the isolated strength that had characterised previous castle construction. The selective reconstruction of key fortresses like Edinburgh and Stirling incorporated innovations in defensive architecture that reflected contemporary military developments, while ensuring that these positions could be held by relatively small garrisons against much larger attacking forces. The integration of these fortified positions into broader defensive networks demonstrated strategic thinking that anticipated future English invasions while maximising Scottish defensive capabilities. The legal reforms that Bruce implemented during this period addressed both the practical requirements of governing an expanded kingdom and the symbolic importance of demonstrating Scottish institutional sophistication to European observers. The codification of Scottish legal procedures and the establishment of standardised judicial practices throughout the kingdom created administrative efficiency while providing evidence that Scottish independence had produced effective governance rather than political chaos. The careful documentation of legal precedents and the training of Scottish legal scholars demonstrated institutional development that contradicted English propaganda about Scottish incapacity for self-governance. The ecclesiastical diplomacy that complemented the Declaration of Arbroath involved systematic efforts to cultivate relationships with influential religious figures throughout Europe, who could provide support for Scottish appeals while countering English diplomatic initiatives. The appointment of Scottish representatives to continental religious institutions created networks of communication and influence that extended far beyond formal diplomatic channels. While the demonstration of Scottish commitment to orthodox Christian practices undermined English arguments about Scottish religious irregularity, the careful management of relationships with Scottish religious institutions ensured that ecclesiastical support for independence remained strong while avoiding conflicts with papal authority that might compromise Scottish diplomatic objectives. The intelligence operations that Bruce maintained during this period provided detailed information about English military preparations and diplomatic initiatives, while ensuring that Scottish strategic planning could anticipate and counter English responses to Scottish diplomatic and military activities. The systematic nature of these intelligence networks, involving coordination between merchants, clergy and diplomatic representatives, created information-gathering capabilities that exceeded those available to most medieval kingdoms, while providing Bruce with strategic advantages that proved crucial for successful resistance to English pressure. The papal recognition of Bruce's kingship in 1324 created the diplomatic foundation for one of medieval Europe's most audacious strategic gambles: the systematic expansion of Scottish influence beyond the traditional boundaries of the kingdom through coordinated military campaigns that would establish Scottish hegemony over the entire Celtic periphery of the British Isles. Edward Bruce's invasion of Ireland in May 1315 represented far more than a diversionary expedition designed to relieve English pressure on Scotland. It constituted the opening phase of a comprehensive strategy to create a pan-Celtic confederation that could permanently neutralise English expansion, while establishing the Bruce dynasty as the dominant power throughout the Irish Sea region. The strategic conception underlying Edward Bruce's Irish expedition reflected Robert's sophisticated understanding of English vulnerabilities and the interconnected nature of English colonial administration throughout the British Isles. English control over Ireland depended fundamentally on the same military and administrative systems that had been employed in Scotland, utilising networks of fortified strongholds garrisoned by professional soldiers, while relying on collaboration with native elites who had been integrated into English feudal structures. The systematic disruption of these systems through coordinated Scottish intervention could potentially collapse English authority throughout Ireland, while creating a second front that would prevent English forces from concentrating against Scottish positions. The initial Scottish landing at Larne in Ulster demonstrated the sophisticated logistical capabilities that Bruce had developed during his years of guerrilla warfare, as the expedition's 6,000 men represented the largest overseas military operation attempted by any Scottish king since the Crusades. The careful coordination required to transport such a substantial force across the Irish Sea, while maintaining secrecy about the expedition's objectives, revealed organisational abilities that exceeded those of most contemporary European kingdoms. The selection of Ulster as the landing site reflected detailed intelligence about Irish political conditions and the strategic advantages offered by the region's proximity to Scottish territorial bases in the Western Isles. Edward Bruce's immediate alliance with Domhnall O'Neill, King of Tir Eoghain, provided the Scottish expedition with crucial local support while legitimising Scottish intervention through appeals to ancient Celtic solidarity against Anglo-Norman oppression. O'Neill's recognition of Edward as rightful High King of Ireland represented both a practical military alliance and a symbolic assertion of Celtic independence that resonated throughout Gaelic Ireland. The ceremonial aspects of this alliance, conducted according to traditional Irish customs that emphasised personal bonds between warrior leaders, demonstrated Scottish sensitivity to Irish cultural traditions, while establishing the political foundations necessary for sustained military cooperation. The military effectiveness of the combined Scottish-Irish forces became apparent during the systematic campaign that eliminated English strongholds throughout Ulster during the summer and autumn of 1315. The capture of Carrickfergus Castle after a prolonged siege demonstrated Scottish mastery of conventional siege warfare while providing access to one of Ireland's most important harbours. The fortress's massive walls and strategic position controlling Belfast Lough had made it the cornerstone of English authority in eastern Ulster. Yet, the garrison's surrender after months of blockade revealed the isolation of English positions once Scottish naval forces controlled the surrounding waters. The tactical innovations that Edward Bruce employed during the Irish campaigns reflected lessons learned from his brother's guerrilla warfare, while adapting these techniques to the different geographical and political conditions of Ireland. The integration of Scottish heavy infantry with Irish light cavalry created tactical flexibility that proved highly effective against English forces trained for conventional European warfare, but unprepared for the mobility and local knowledge that characterise Celtic military traditions. The systematic destruction of English supply lines through coordinated raids prevented enemy forces from maintaining concentrated defensive positions, while forcing them to disperse their strength in attempts to protect multiple vulnerable targets. The coronation of Edward Bruce as High King of Ireland at Dundalk on May 1, 1316, represented the ceremonial culmination of Scottish military success, while establishing the constitutional framework for permanent Scottish influence over Irish affairs. The ceremony itself followed ancient Irish traditions that emphasised the spiritual and cultural dimensions of royal authority, rather than the feudal relationships that characterised Anglo-Norman kingship. The participation of Irish bishops and clan leaders in the coronation provided religious and political legitimacy that extended far beyond the military achievements that had made the ceremony possible. However, the practical challenges of maintaining Scottish authority over such an extensive and culturally diverse territory soon revealed the limitations of military conquest without corresponding administrative and economic capabilities. The Irish political landscape remained fragmented among competing clan loyalties and regional power centres that had maintained semi-autonomous status throughout previous periods of English rule. Edward Bruce's attempts to impose unified royal authority over these diverse communities encountered resistance from Irish leaders who had supported Scottish intervention against English rule, but remained unwilling to accept Scottish domination as a permanent replacement. The economic disruption caused by 3 years of constant warfare had devastated Irish agricultural production, while destroying the commercial networks that had provided prosperity for both native Irish communities and Anglo-Norman settlers. The systematic destruction of English administrative centres had eliminated the institutional framework necessary for tax collection and judicial administration, while the flight of English officials and merchants had disrupted the commercial relationships that connected Ireland to broader European markets. Edward Bruce's government lacked the resources necessary to restore these systems, while simultaneously maintaining the military forces required to defend Scottish conquests against inevitable English counterattacks. The logistical challenges of supplying Scottish forces operating hundreds of miles from their home bases proved increasingly difficult as the Irish campaign extended beyond its initially projected duration. The sea routes connecting Scotland and Ireland remained vulnerable to English naval interdiction, while the overland supply lines within Ireland faced constant harassment from English forces and Irish communities that had grown hostile to Scottish occupation. The gradual attrition of Scottish military strength through casualties, desertion, and the demands of garrisoning captured territories reduced Edward's effective fighting force, while English reinforcements continued to arrive from Wales and England. Robert Bruce's personal intervention in Ireland during 1317 represented both recognition of his brother's difficulties and demonstration of Scottish determination to maintain their Irish conquests regardless of the costs involved. The king's arrival with substantial reinforcements temporarily restored Scottish military superiority, while providing opportunities to address the political and administrative problems that were undermining Edward's authority. The brothers' joint campaign during the winter of 1317 to 1318 achieved significant tactical successes, including the capture of several important strongholds and the defeat of English forces near Slane, but failed to resolve the fundamental strategic problems that made permanent Scottish control over Ireland increasingly unsustainable. The political situation in Scotland during Robert's absence in Ireland created additional pressures that limited the resources available for Irish operations, while threatening the stability of Scottish independence itself. The Souls Conspiracy's discovery in 1320 had revealed the persistence of internal opposition to Bruce's rule. while the constant demands of border warfare required substantial military forces to defend Scottish territories against English raids and invasion threats. The division of Scottish military resources between domestic defence and Irish conquest created vulnerabilities that English strategists could exploit through coordinated attacks on multiple fronts. The death of Edward Bruce at the Battle of Faughart on October 14, 1318, eliminated Scottish leadership in Ireland, while providing Edward II with his most significant military victory since the early years of Robert's reign. The battle itself resulted from Edward Bruce's characteristic aggressiveness and his unwillingness to accept the defensive strategies that might have preserved Scottish positions until reinforcements could arrive from Scotland. The English forces commanded by John de Birmingham had carefully prepared their positions to maximise their advantages in heavy cavalry, while limiting the mobility that had proven crucial for Scottish tactical success throughout the Irish campaigns. The tactical circumstances of Faughart demonstrated both the strengths and limitations of the military methods that had proven successful during the Scottish independence struggle. Edward Bruce's forces, reduced by years of campaigning to fewer than 2,000 men, faced English armies that outnumbered them substantially while possessing superior equipment and professional training. The Scottish decision to accept battle under these disadvantageous conditions reflected both strategic desperation and personal honour codes that prioritised martial courage over tactical prudence. The systematic destruction of Scottish resistance during the engagement eliminated not only Edward Bruce himself, but also most of the experienced commanders who had provided leadership for Irish operations throughout the preceding 3 years. The immediate aftermath of Faughart saw the rapid collapse of Scottish authority throughout Ireland as Irish allies abandoned their allegiance while English forces moved systematically to recapture territories that had been under Scottish control. The restoration of English administrative systems proceeded with remarkable speed, suggesting that Scottish rule had never achieved the deep popular support necessary for permanent political transformation. The Irish clan leaders who had initially welcomed Scottish intervention as liberation from English oppression had discovered that Scottish domination involved similar constraints on traditional autonomy while providing fewer economic benefits than the previous English administration. The strategic consequences of the Irish expedition's failure extended far beyond the immediate loss of military resources and personnel, as the campaign's collapse eliminated Scottish hopes of creating the multi-front pressure that might have forced English recognition of Scottish independence on favourable terms. The concentration of Scottish military efforts in Ireland had prevented Robert from exploiting English weaknesses in other theatres while allowing Edward II to consolidate his domestic political position through the only significant military success of his reign. The resources devoted to Irish operations, including substantial financial expenditures and the loss of experienced military personnel, had weakened Scottish defensive capabilities at a time when English determination to recover their Scottish territories remained undiminished. However, the Irish expedition had also demonstrated Scottish military capabilities and strategic ambitions that commanded European respect while establishing precedents for Scottish intervention in Celtic affairs that would influence British politics for centuries. The 3-year duration of Scottish control over substantial Irish territories proved that English authority throughout the British Isles remained vulnerable to coordinated Celtic resistance, while the tactical innovations developed during Irish operations enhanced Scottish military effectiveness in subsequent border campaigns. The political relationships established with Irish clan leaders, while insufficient to sustain permanent Scottish rule, created diplomatic connections that could be activated for future operations against English interests. The return of Scottish focus to domestic consolidation following Edward Bruce's death coincided with renewed English military pressure along the border that tested the defensive systems Robert had developed during his years of territorial expansion. Edward II's inability to mount major invasions of Scotland had not prevented systematic English raiding that disrupted Scottish economic recovery while maintaining pressure on border communities whose loyalty remained crucial for Scottish territorial integrity. The English strategy of constant low-level harassment was designed to demonstrate Scottish inability to protect their subjects while creating economic pressures that might force Scottish acceptance of English suzerainty. Robert's response to renewed border warfare demonstrated the evolution of his strategic thinking from the guerrilla tactics of his early campaigns to the sophisticated defensive concepts appropriate for an established kingdom facing persistent external threats. The systematic fortification of border strongholds followed principles that emphasized mutual support and rapid communication, rather than the isolated strength that had characterized previous Scottish defensive systems. The integration of these fortified positions with mobile forces capable of rapid response to English incursions created defensive depth that proved highly effective against the raiding tactics that constituted England's primary military option during this period. The intelligence networks that Robert maintained throughout northern England provided detailed information about English military preparations, while ensuring that Scottish defensive planning could anticipate and counter English strategic initiatives. The systematic nature of these intelligence operations, involving coordination between Scottish agents embedded in English administrative systems and border communities whose loyalties transcended political boundaries, created information-gathering capabilities that exceeded those available to most medieval kingdoms. The integration of intelligence gathering with diplomatic and commercial activities provided multiple sources of information while maintaining operational security that prevented English counterintelligence efforts from compromising Scottish strategic planning. The gradual shift in Robert's personal role from active military commander to strategic coordinator reflected both his advancing age and the institutional development that had transformed Scotland from a rebel movement into a functioning kingdom capable of sustained resistance to English pressure. The delegation of tactical command to subordinates like James Douglas and Thomas Randolph allowed Robert to focus on the diplomatic and administrative challenges that required royal authority, while ensuring that Scottish military operations maintained the professional competence necessary for continued success against English forces. The development of this command structure created institutional continuity that would prove crucial for Scottish survival during the succession crisis that would follow Robert's death. The succession arrangements that Robert developed during his final years reflected his understanding that Scottish independence remained vulnerable to the dynastic instabilities that had characterised previous periods of Scottish history. The recognition of his young son David as heir presumptive following Edward Bruce's death created constitutional clarity regarding the royal succession, while establishing the legal foundations necessary for regency government during David's minority. The careful selection of regents and advisers who possessed both political competence and demonstrated loyalty to Scottish independence ensured that the kingdom's leadership would maintain continuity of policy regardless of the personal qualities of individual rulers. The health problems that began to affect Robert during the mid-1320s created additional urgency regarding succession planning, while limiting his ability to provide personal leadership for military operations that continued to require royal authority for maximum effectiveness. The gradual delegation of responsibilities to trusted subordinates allowed Scottish government to function effectively despite the king's physical limitations, but also created opportunities for factional disputes among nobles whose personal ambitions had been suppressed during the crisis years of the independence struggle. The careful management of these political tensions required diplomatic skills that complemented Robert's military achievements, while ensuring that Scottish unity would survive the transition to new leadership. The economic policies that Robert pursued during his final years demonstrated sophisticated understanding of the relationship between commercial prosperity and political stability, as his government actively promoted trade relationships that could provide Scotland with the resources necessary for continued resistance to English pressure, while reducing Scottish dependence on English markets. The development of Scottish commercial connections with Flemish merchants and French trading centres created alternative sources for manufactured goods and luxury items, while providing markets for Scottish agricultural and mineral products. The systematic exploitation of Scotland's natural resources, particularly in regions that had been underdeveloped during the English occupation, provided substantial additions to royal revenues while demonstrating Scottish control over territories that England continued to claim. The diplomatic initiatives that Robert maintained throughout his final years involved systematic efforts to strengthen Scottish international relationships, while countering English attempts to isolate Scotland from European political developments. However, by 1328, the cumulative effects of decades of warfare, the physical demands of constant campaigning, and what contemporary physicians described as a wasting disease began to take an increasingly severe toll on the king's health. The symptoms that manifested during the final years of his reign, progressive weakness, skin lesions, and periodic fevers, have led modern medical historians to suggest various diagnoses ranging from leprosy to psoriatic arthritis, though the exact nature of his ailment remains debated among scholars. The Treaty of Edinburgh-Northampton, concluded on May 4, 1328, represented the culmination of Robert's diplomatic efforts and provided formal English recognition of Scottish independence that had eluded his predecessors for over 3 decades. Edward III's acceptance of Scottish sovereignty, negotiated through the marriage alliance between his sister Joan of the Tower and Robert's son David, established the legal foundations for permanent peace between the kingdoms while acknowledging the legitimacy of Bruce's kingship. The treaty's terms included English renunciation of all claims to Scottish overlordship, the return of Scottish royal regalia that had been seized during Edward VI's conquest, and substantial financial compensation for Scottish territorial losses during the Wars of Independence. The marriage arrangements that accompanied the treaty reflected Robert's understanding that dynastic connections could provide more durable foundations for Anglo-Scottish peace than military victories alone. The union between the 7-year-old David Bruce and the 8-year-old Joan of the Tower created blood relationships between the royal houses that would theoretically prevent future conflicts while establishing English recognition of Bruce dynastic legitimacy. The elaborate wedding ceremony conducted at Berwick in July 1328 demonstrated the international significance of the alliance, while providing both kingdoms with opportunities to display their wealth and cultural sophistication to European observers. However, the domestic opposition that the treaty encountered in both kingdoms revealed the limitations of diplomatic solutions to conflicts rooted in fundamental disagreements about sovereignty and national identity. English nobles who had lost Scottish estates during the independence struggle viewed the treaty as an unacceptable surrender of rightful territorial claims, while many Scots remained suspicious of any agreement that required ongoing relationships with their traditional enemies. The payment of £20,000 to England as compensation for territorial losses created particular resentment among Scottish taxpayers, who questioned why their kingdom should pay tribute for recovering its own independence. Robert's awareness that his declining health might prevent him from ensuring the treaty's implementation created additional urgency regarding the succession arrangements that would determine Scotland's future political stability. The elaborate ceremonies that accompanied young David's recognition as heir apparent during 1328 emphasised both the legitimacy of Bruce dynastic claims and the institutional continuity that would preserve Scottish independence regardless of individual rulers' personal qualities. The careful selection of regents and advisers who possessed both administrative competence and demonstrated loyalty to Scottish sovereignty reflected Robert's understanding that effective governance during a royal minority would require exceptional political skill and unwavering commitment to independence principles. The religious dimensions of Robert's final illness created complications that extended beyond personal suffering to encompass broader questions about divine judgment and royal legitimacy that had haunted his reign since John Comyn's murder. The king's determination to fulfill his crusading vow, originally undertaken during his youth but postponed by the demands of the independence struggle, represented both personal spiritual necessity and political demonstration that his kingship enjoyed divine sanction despite the violent circumstances of his accession. The elaborate preparations for a crusading expedition during 1328 and 1329, including the recruitment of knights and the accumulation of financial resources, demonstrated Scottish commitment to Christian orthodoxy while providing evidence that the kingdom possessed the resources and organisational capabilities necessary for overseas military operations. The deterioration of Robert's condition during the winter of 1328 to 1329 created immediate practical challenges regarding the governance of a kingdom that remained vulnerable to external threats while facing internal succession uncertainties. The establishment of his court at Cardross Manor, a modest residence that contrasted sharply with the elaborate castles that had housed previous Scottish kings, reflected both the king's personal preferences and the practical requirements of managing his illness, while maintaining access to government officials and foreign ambassadors. The manor's location near Dumbarton provided convenient access to sea routes that connected Scotland with Ireland and France, while offering the peaceful environment that physicians recommended for recovery. The final months of Robert's life witnessed intensive diplomatic activity designed to secure international guarantees for Scottish independence that could survive potential challenges to his son's minority government. The papal confirmation of Scottish sovereignty, achieved through years of careful negotiation and substantial financial contributions to church projects, provided ecclesiastical legitimacy that complemented the secular recognition obtained through the English treaty. The French alliance's renewal through formal treaties that specified mutual military obligations created additional security guarantees, while demonstrating continued European support for Scottish independence against any future English attempts at reconquest. The king's physical decline during the spring of 1329 was accompanied by careful arrangements for the distribution of his personal effects and the fulfilment of religious obligations that reflected both medieval Christian beliefs about death and preparation for the afterlife, and practical political considerations about maintaining royal dignity during the succession transition. The detailed instructions that Robert provided regarding his funeral arrangements emphasised both his royal status and his personal humility, specifying burial at Dunfermline Abbey among his royal predecessors, while requesting simple ceremonies that avoided the elaborate displays characteristic of other medieval royal funerals. The most remarkable aspect of Robert's final preparations involved his instructions regarding his heart, which was to be removed after death and carried to the Holy Land by James Douglas as fulfilment of his crusading vow. This unprecedented arrangement reflected both the king's personal spiritual concerns and his sophisticated understanding of how symbolic gestures could enhance his posthumous reputation, while providing his most trusted lieutenant with a mission that would remove him from Scottish politics during the vulnerable early years of David's reign. The selection of Douglas for this sacred mission demonstrated the extraordinary trust that had developed between the king and his most capable military commander during their years of shared struggle. Robert Bruce died at Cardross Manor on June 7th, 1329, surrounded by his closest advisors and family members who had gathered to witness the passing of the king, whose personal determination and strategic brilliance had achieved Scottish independence against overwhelming odds. Contemporary accounts describe his final hours as peaceful, with the king maintaining consciousness sufficiently to provide final instructions regarding government policy and personal bequests while receiving the last sacraments according to Catholic tradition. The immediate secrecy that surrounded his death reflected concerns about maintaining political stability during the transition to minority rule, as his advisors sought to complete succession arrangements before potential enemies could exploit the kingdom's temporary vulnerability. The removal of Robert's heart, according to his final instructions, was conducted by royal physicians using techniques that reflected contemporary medical knowledge while ensuring preservation of the organ for its intended journey. The heart was placed in a silver casket that Douglas wore suspended from his neck during the subsequent crusading expedition, creating a powerful symbol of continued royal presence even after the king's physical death. The remainder of Robert's body was embalmed according to royal tradition and transported to Dunfermline Abbey for burial in the choir near the high altar, a location that emphasised both his royal status and his role as defender of Scottish Christianity. The funeral ceremonies conducted at Dunfermline during late June 1329 provided opportunities for Scottish nobles to demonstrate their continued loyalty to the Bruce dynasty, while displaying the kingdom's stability and prosperity to foreign observers who might question Scottish capability for effective self-governance during a royal minority. The elaborate procession that accompanied Robert's remains from Cardross to Dunfermline involved representatives from throughout Scotland and demonstrated the territorial unity that had been achieved through his military and political leadership. The participation of foreign ambassadors in the funeral ceremonies provided international recognition of Scottish sovereignty, while establishing diplomatic precedents that would prove valuable during subsequent negotiations. James Douglas's departure for the Holy Land in early 1330, carrying Robert's heart, represented one of medieval history's most romantic and politically sophisticated gestures, combining personal devotion with strategic calculation in ways that enhanced both participants' historical reputations. The expedition's route through France and Spain provided opportunities for diplomatic contacts that strengthened Scottish international relationships, while demonstrating continued Scottish commitment to Christian causes despite the kingdom's recent conflicts with papal authority. Douglas's death at the Battle of Tiber in August 1330, while fighting alongside Spanish forces against Muslim armies, fulfilled his own crusading obligations, while ensuring that Robert's heart reached its intended destination in the Holy Land. The immediate succession crisis that followed Robert's death tested the institutional foundations that he had established during his reign, while revealing both the strengths and vulnerabilities of Scottish independence under minority rule. The regency arrangements that placed Thomas Randolph, Earl of Moray, in effective control of government demonstrated the continuing influence of Robert's closest associates, while ensuring policy continuity during the transition period. However, Randolph's death in July 1332 eliminated the most capable of Robert's lieutenants and created opportunities for Edward Balliol's invasion that would threaten Scottish independence for nearly 2 decades. The long-term impact of Robert's reign on Scottish national identity extended far beyond the immediate achievement of political independence to encompass fundamental changes in how Scots understood their relationship to royal authority and their collective identity as a distinct people. The Declaration of Arbroath's articulation of conditional kingship and popular sovereignty established principles that would influence Scottish political thought for centuries, while providing intellectual foundations for resistance to absolute monarchy that would prove crucial during later constitutional conflicts. The integration of Highland and Lowland populations under unified royal authority created unprecedented national unity, while establishing cultural precedents that would shape Scottish identity through subsequent historical periods. The legal traditions that Robert established during his reign reflected both practical necessities created by territorial recovery and broader philosophical commitments to justice and royal accountability that distinguish Scottish governance from contemporary European monarchies. The systematic codification of Scottish legal procedures and the establishment of standardised judicial practices created institutional frameworks that survived subsequent political upheavals, while providing foundations for legal development that would influence Scottish jurisprudence for generations. The emphasis on royal obligation to defend subjects' liberties, articulated most clearly in the Declaration of Arbroath, established constitutional principles that would prove crucial during later conflicts between royal authority and popular rights. The military innovations that Robert developed during the independence struggle transformed Scottish tactical capabilities while establishing strategic principles that would influence Scottish defence policy throughout subsequent centuries. The integration of conventional military techniques with guerrilla warfare methods created tactical flexibility that proved highly effective against larger and better equipped enemy forces, while demonstrating the importance of adapting military methods to specific geographical and political circumstances. The systematic destruction of captured fortifications to deny their use to enemies became a distinctive feature of Scottish military strategy that reflected both practical resource limitations and sophisticated understanding of defensive requirements. The economic policies that Robert pursued during his reign established foundations for Scottish commercial development that would prove crucial for maintaining independence against persistent English pressure. The systematic exploitation of Scotland's natural resources, particularly mineral wealth that had been underdeveloped during previous periods, provided revenues that supported military operations while demonstrating Scottish territorial control to international observers. The development of alternative trading relationships with continental markets reduced Scottish dependence on English commercial connections, while creating diplomatic ties that complemented military alliances in supporting Scottish independence. The ecclesiastical achievements of Robert's reign included not only the resolution of his personal excommunication, but also the establishment of Scottish church independence that would influence religious development throughout subsequent centuries. The appointment of Scottish bishops who supported independence while maintaining theological orthodoxy created ecclesiastical leadership that could provide both spiritual guidance and political support for royal policies. The systematic restoration of religious institutions that had been damaged during the Wars of Independence demonstrated Scottish commitment to Christian values while providing evidence of the kingdom's recovery from wartime devastation. The cultural legacy of Robert's reign encompassed both immediate political achievements and longer-term influences on Scottish literature, art, and historical memory that would shape national identity for centuries. The heroic narratives that developed around his guerrilla campaigns and ultimate victory provided inspirational examples that would influence Scottish resistance to foreign domination during subsequent historical periods. The integration of Gaelic and Anglo-Norman cultural traditions under unified royal patronage created distinctive Scottish cultural syntheses that reflected the kingdom's diverse heritage while establishing foundations for future artistic and intellectual development. The historical memory of Robert Bruce evolved through successive generations of Scottish chroniclers and storytellers who transformed his military and political achievements into legendary narratives that emphasized themes of heroic resistance and ultimate triumph against overwhelming odds. The stories of his exile in the Western Isles, his innovative military tactics, and his determination to achieve independence despite repeated defeats provided powerful symbols of Scottish resilience that would inspire future generations during periods of foreign domination or internal division. The famous legend of the spider, whether historically accurate or not, encapsulated the persistence and strategic thinking that characterized his approach to the independence struggle. The international recognition that Robert achieved during his lifetime established precedents for Scottish participation in European political and diplomatic networks that would prove crucial for maintaining independence during subsequent centuries. The French alliance that he negotiated provided military and diplomatic support that complemented Scottish defensive capabilities, while demonstrating that Scottish independence served broader European balance of power considerations. The papal recognition of Scottish sovereignty established ecclesiastical legitimacy that survived subsequent political upheavals, while providing foundations for Scottish church independence that would prove crucial during later religious conflicts. The institutional developments that occurred during Robert's reign created governmental capabilities that enabled Scotland to function effectively as an independent kingdom, despite its relatively small population and limited economic resources. The restoration of the Scottish Exchequer and the establishment of systematic revenue collection provided financial foundations for military defence, while demonstrating administrative competence that contradicted English propaganda about Scottish incapacity for self-governance. The development of legal and judicial systems that combined traditional Scottish practices with innovations required by changed political circumstances created institutional frameworks that would survive subsequent challenges while providing foundations for future governmental development. Robert the Bruce's death marked the end of an era in Scottish history, but his achievements in securing independence and establishing the institutional foundations for effective governance created legacies that would influence Scottish development for centuries. His transformation from a disputed claimant to the throne into an internationally recognised king demonstrated the possibility of achieving political objectives through strategic persistence and tactical innovation, even when facing overwhelming odds. The principles of conditional kingship and popular sovereignty that emerged during his reign would prove crucial for Scottish constitutional development while providing intellectual foundations for resistance to absolute monarchy that would influence British political thought during subsequent centuries. The heart of Robert Bruce, carried by James Douglas to the Holy Land and ultimately returned to Scotland after Douglas's death at Tiber, became one of the most powerful symbols in Scottish history, representing both the king's personal devotion and the spiritual dimensions of the independence struggle. The heart's eventual burial at Melrose Abbey created a pilgrimage site that would attract visitors for centuries while providing physical evidence of the extraordinary personal sacrifices that had been required to achieve Scottish freedom. This final gesture, combining medieval religious devotion with political symbolism, perfectly encapsulated the complex motivations and achievements that had characterised Robert's remarkable reign and established his enduring place in Scottish national memory as the greatest of Scotland's warrior kings.